Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. A wedding at Mr. Matt's house was bound to make a lasting impression, above all on the owner of the mansion. The best people of the city fought for the right to sit at the same table with the most successful man in this part of the world. Wedding is not only beautiful gifts, fancy dress, and invited stars. It is also a great opportunity to discuss new contracts and share another piece of the pie, which economists will later call super income. Mr. Matt only needed to snap 2 fingers to have his table immediately covered with the best delicacies and delights. And the rumor was complicated by stars and celebrities. George was in charge of vegetables, the freshest tomatoes, peppers and cucumbers from his greenhouses, herbs and lots more. Charles claimed to have personally slaughtered a lamb, 2 piglets, and got into a real battle with chickens and turkeys, as long as there was enough meat and poultry on the table. Giovanni Greca, concerned about fish and seafood, salmon, tuna, shrimp, huge lobsters, and other select delicacies. But Luca Moretti and his family prepared a giant cake, which was too much even for this crowd of 200 guests. He delivered it together with a transparent refrigerator to the generators and placed it near the main table. Lower-ranking guests provided fresh bread and rolls, salads, appetizers, and other snacks, without which a wedding would never be a celebration. 2 themed areas were set up on a huge plot of land near the house. On one performed modern music compositions, on the other retro and classics of Franz Bianca. The most talented sound engineer of the present day arranged the musical streams so that they did not overlap. "We Italians have to help each other," smiled Mr. Rinaldi, who was in charge of the groom, and coincidentally the bride's gorgeous dress. Like jewelry or heirlooms, vestments. Here we brought in a special box, inside of which was maintained microclimate. "I'm an American," Mr. Matt said loudly, "and put this place out of your mind." "I beg your pardon, Mr. It's ingratiating," said Rinaldi. "I meant to say we Americans should help each other." He had reason to be nervous. Today, the Rinaldi family was to go one step higher. From now on, he would take on the toughest challenges. Construction contracts on the coast would cover his skyscrapers. Sports arenas would spring up here and there, each of which he would keep a small stake in for the sake of management and profit. And his son, will get the most gorgeous and wealthy girl in this part of the earth. "Where is James?" unceremoniously asked Mr. "He's the one who should be standing here like a bayonet waiting for me to give the word. But you know the traditions, don't you?" Once again looked ingratiatingly at the millionaire Rinaldi. "He'll come with an orchestra. There will be a beautiful song and then a dance. Even if we've become Americans, that's no reason to forget the music." "Ah, tradition," mumbled we this. He wished this interminable day would come to a logical conclusion sooner. Talking in a panebristic manner to Mr. Rinaldi, the construction magnate, he was only hiding his own insecurity. Wacko needs Monica as much as she needs him. Or rather, he needs Mr. It needs this alliance to solidify its position and become all-powerful. The construction empire will take its rightful place in his business package along with manufacturing, tourism, and gambling. Yes, he is strong and powerful. No business is solved in the city without his weighty word, but his own financial strength is woefully lacking. The Rinaldi family are other wordless toilers. They can cover the whole world with these boring and tasty tasks, which, nevertheless, are very well worth and perfectly sold. They have huge circulating resources that will help it get stronger. "Oh, Rinaldi," said this and clapped his hands loudly. "There's a tradition you and I have forgotten. Let's drink a glass of wine with cheese and meat in honor of our union with you, so that this day went as per notes." The groom's father smiled. He was beginning to feel uncomfortable with the nasty mood of it. But here he seemed to feel a little better when he remembered the meat and wine. As if by magic, a waiter with a huge tray appeared near them. How he could only hold the enormous tray. He meticulously selected a red dry wine with a long aging. Mr. It himself filled 2 glasses to the brim and held one out to Rinaldi. "Let's raise a glass to the fact that our cities are united," proposed the master of the house, and like branches of noble grapes intertwined, and from them turned out a beautiful wine, which will be chased by the best houses of the world. Bottoms up. A fine toast, praised Rinaldi. Unlike his vis-a-vis, he was not good at impromptu speeches, preferring to pay money to a professional writer. He's prepared an excellent speech for the ceremony. It's waiting on his tablet, but he forgot the welcome toast. "That's all you're gonna say?" Surprised. That's how he froze with his glass raised. "I want to say," stretched Rinaldi, and tried to gather his thoughts, "that our children with you will erect the world's tallest skyscraper. Rinaldi's name will be Rinaldi, and there will always be lights on all the floors for us." Meta touched his expensive glassware to his new relative. The toast was beautiful, but the fact that the family's proud surname was to be relegated to the background. Disappointing. It was an issue he'd forgotten to discuss when he dealt with all the formalities of the wedding. Nothing. The grandchildren may well want to carry his surname. Good thing it sounds beautiful. "Well," Rinaldi said, the master of the house, emptying his glass and snacking on ham, "it's time for me to check on our star guests. You haven't forgotten who will be performing on our stage tonight, have you?" Of course, it would cost a fortune for an outsider to bring in so many celebrities, but many of them owed Mr. This the beginning of their careers, and therefore agreed to perform for free, and the millionaire only had to pay for the flight and hotel. It was already 5 o'clock, and the guests gradually began to arrive. They all approached Mr. Matt, shook his huge striped palm, and wished prosperity and prosperity to the new family. The master of the house wore a luxurious suit, despite the heat, but on his broad forehead did not even appear vapor. "How wonderful is the weather." Mrs. Smith, the wife of the owner of a large retail chain, smiled. "Specially for you," smiled back at Matt. "Thank you for the cheeses you sent to our table." "Oh, it's such a small thing," Mrs. Smith waved her hand. "You should have seen the gift Angie prepared for our young ones. Would you sign a lifetime contract with us for your Italian oils?" "Mister, it's an exclusive contract." The landlord smiled even wider. "But no," he thought haughtily. "You can't buy me that cheap." Matta liked total control over the situation, and so every half hour his secretary, a charming girl named Anush, called him and reported whether everything was going according to plan. Chief of Security Tan reported every hour, reporting anything suspicious. "If you see even a shadow." Leet whispered to Mr. Matta, talking to Tom. "Nothing and no one should mar this day." "That's right," Mr. Joe replied, the head of security. "The situation is under complete control." Mita was very fond of his faithful guard, who resembled a dog in his devotion. The one by animal subtly felt his master. For example, it was he who came up with the idea to remake the name Giuseppe to the American form of Joe. The Mr. was very pleased with that. Yes, that's what he started calling himself. The call came from Angie 5 minutes ahead of the checkout time. "Mr." said the secretary, puzzled. "We have a strange guest here. It's on the list. Roughly asked us this." Full control, in his opinion, did not mean diving into every detail. "But since these nitwits can't do otherwise, no." Anish replied, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, it's some ancient old woman. She's demanding you come down because of her diction. I can't understand whether she wants to give or take something. Put her on." "I ordered it." "Yes, Signora Mr. Giuseppe. There's an old lady whose voice is on the other end of the line." "Mr. Giuseppe, who am I?" "Me?" The millionaire's steely voice rang out. "I don't recognize it." "Measure for line," continued the old lady in her sweet voice. "I happen to know that there was such a joyous occasion in your house that I couldn't pass by. You have no idea what a journey I have made. I came from far away. So we are strangers." Cut Matta off. "I'm sorry, Signora, but I did not invite you to my house this day." I know you've forgotten." The old lady's, whose voice on the other end of the wire was getting louder. "Don't worry, mister, don't worry. I'm not offended. I'm often forgotten now. I need Giuseppe's help. Asked the old woman and immediately switched to you. Only you can help me. Only you, Giuseppe. Put the phone back on, ma'am. A test of strength. Mr. Joe. The millionaire's broad forehead was showing from. He didn't sweat at all until he started to get nervous. Mr. Matt made a brief gesture to the waiter, literally one with a Coke. The one, as if having read the big boss's mind, ran up to him and swiped it neatly. It was as if the landlord was not on the phone, but performing a complex operation. He said, "Mother, send this old woman away. And if she persists, call the police. The sheriff promised me they'd have a car around here somewhere. But Mr. Joe, outside, the secretary. She says she needs help, and she has important information." I said drive. Demanded the millionaire not to bother me about such nonsense anymore. Because, you know, there's a whole line of people wanting to take your place. There were more and more guests. They were occupying a huge section of Mr. They were touring the luxurious interiors of his mansion. They tasted the appetizers and examined the table that was set right in the garden. The stylists finished decorating the photo area, and a good dozen photographers were walking around the guests so that everyone could fill their ribbon with great pictures. Now we need to get to the most enjoyable part of this ceremony. His daughter, his baby girl, is finally going to jump out in marriage. This furtively brushed a tear off his prickly cheek. Soon, very soon, he will be babysitting his grandchildren, teaching them how to shoot a slingshot and kick a soccer ball. The phone rang again. I told you to drive that damned old woman to hell. Trial of strength. Millionaire, Mr. Mehta. Stammering, said the secretary. It seems, there's been an emergency. What kind of emergency? Calmly, the head of the family clarified. He was famous for his ability to keep his composure in any, even the most difficult situation. A catastrophe. Anish screamed. 3 or 4 o'clock before the fateful call of his assistant, Mr. Ito decided to make sure that both the dress and hair of Monica correspond to the highest level of the ceremony organized by him. His daughter decided well in the guest house where all her friends and girlfriends were comfortably accommodated. Matt let them walk around all night and even paid for the food and drinks himself. That's an unprecedented move on his part. As long as the kids were happy. He explained his act to the head of security, who was worried about safety, keeping an eye on them, but through his fingers. The kids, most of whom were now approaching the age of 25, didn't fail, didn't break anything, didn't cause the police to be called. And if anyone was being domineering, it wasn't his daughter, or she did it without anyone noticing. Now in the room were workers to this ring. When young people want to continue hiding from the adults, everything should be ready. Very young boys and girls were arranging a slide of glasses through which the champagne would soon flow. And one waiter looked Mr. It straight in the eye and smiled impishly. Where on earth had he seen him? Ignoring the familiarity of the millionaire, strode to the second floor. He kicked the hairdresser and makeup artists out of his daughter's room and asked her girlfriends to leave. Then he rose from his chair and meticulously examined Monica, trying to find the slightest flaw. But no, everything was perfect. Did his daughter, his pride and joy, really look like the $5-6 million he had invested in this wedding? "Congratulations to you, daughter," he whispered, hugging Monica gently. The main thing was not to wrinkle the dress or damage the makeup. The photos will decorate the main news feeds of the agencies, and therefore should not drop the authority of Matt's family. Challenged with what? Monica asked. With being able to tie your business to the Rinaldi family. Mr. This froze like thunderstruck. From whom but his daughter? A clever and calculating girl. He didn't expect to hear anything like that. After all, he had offered her a choice of 3 suitors, and she herself had settled on Vasco. The young man, of course, was a bit of a god, and in his Mr. This presence, he generally swallowed his tongue like a snake. But all in all, the guy was great, and he certainly loved her. He loved her. Yeah, the guy's a slob. But that's exactly what Monica needed. And importantly, with the financial ability to fulfill all her needs, which can grow over the years. What do you mean by that? Dad asked. What I mean is shut up. Suddenly shouted Mr. I don't even want to hear it. Any girl in your place would be dancing with joy. And you're just as nosy as ever. Why don't you ever want to hear me? Monica asked. And there were tears in her eyes. And there were tears in her eyes. Everything I do for you and for the family, replied Mr. This, trying to give his capital voice tenderness. You should be grateful to me. You know James is not the hero of my novel, sighed Monica. Yes, we'll settle well. He loves me. He's been very gentle with me. But to live with him all my life, I'd die of homesickness. Mr. thought about it. He certainly shouldn't have upset his daughter on a day like this. She will marry James anyway. It was a done deal. But she'd remember his pressure and despotism for the rest of her life, which means she'll hate him. I had to sweeten the pill. Fortunately, he had already taken care of this issue a month ago and prepared a gift that would make any girl fly to the seventh heaven with delight. Forgive me, darling. Forgive my pressure and this arrogant tone. You know how hard it is to make these decisions, but I'm the one who takes full responsibility for them. Here you go. We said it, holding out a ring to our daughter. I've prepared a gift for you. What is it? Asked the bride. It's a real heirloom. With delight, said the father of the family. Can you believe that this trinket was worn by the wife of the first president of this glorious country? Monica looked at the ring meticulously. It looked really beautiful, but was it worth spending a lot of money on something like that? The girl imagined how her father's men had gotten it. Maybe they had stolen it from a museum. And what if they hadn't? She didn't even want to think about that. Wear it with pride. We said it solemnly. It's a gift from me personally. And do not forget for a second, dear, that we are Americans with an Italian surname, sarcastically said Monica. What's the point of all this? Are we Italian, American, or Jewish? What's the difference? How dare you? Mada was indignant. Me and my parents have endured abuse and insults all my life, just so that you could be representatives of this God-chosen nation. And without my last name, no important issue is decided in this city. Isn't that God's plan? I've told you 100 times I'm not interested. Monica snapped at me. I just want to make my own music. You hear it. There she went again, talking about her stupid songs. Joe was already cursing the day many, many years ago when he'd given his daughter a guitar and taught her a few chords. Yes, she sang wonderfully, but he'd seen her financiers with brains like hers. She could multiply her family's fortune 10 or 20 times over. What awaits her on the stage? First, you have to invest a whole ton of money without any guarantees of return. A star's career lasts 5 or 10 years. And then what? But no, you can't take any chances. Even though I'm American, we said it threateningly, losing control of ourselves. But I might as well take an Italian whip and tap dance on your international ass. Sorry, Poe, immediately replied Monica, who understood the reality of such threats. The best men in town and country are doing your wedding. Couldn't settle down. Millionaire, do me the courtesy of at least smiling. Keep your thoughts to yourself. What's gotten into you today anyway? Because I'm in love with someone else. Monica explained. Who? Mr. Matt asked. He was going to explain to her that you can live with one person and love another. The main thing is to do it carefully, so as not to create rumors and speculation. And as soon as Monica opened her mouth, the phone rang. Tony Class, the eccentric billionaire Mr. Joe had pinned his hopes on, had arrived. Not a word. Asked it, raising his hand. I love you, daughter, Mr. Tony, said the master of the household in as kind a tone as his speech apparatus was capable of. What an honor and a surprise. I'm on my way. So the guests have arrived. The tables are bursting with refreshments, and the musicians on both stages still continue to fill the air with beautiful melodies. However, Monica is missing, and there's no clarity on her disappearance. The saddest part is that no one saw where she went, neither her stylist, makeup artist, nor her girlfriends. It's like she vanished into thin air. It's Mr. This is the dilemma of canceling the wedding or hoping that Monica's kidnapping is a bad joke. Santi, her best friend, was crying, clutching a teddy bear in her hands, and somehow nursing herself back to health for what had happened. The local police office sent 2 detectives at once to speed up the investigation. The gentleman went along with it. His weight was too high. "Tell me again," asked one detective, tall, thin, addressing Santa. But no tears. "Honey, what happened?" Musicians in traditional Mexican attire entered the guest house. She was sobbing. "I don't know who booked them. They started playing their songs, doing round dances with us. When I came to my senses, I saw that Monica was nowhere to be found, and I sounded the alarm." "How long did the singing, dancing, and destruction of tequila last?" the tall detective asked. "I don't even know," stretched out to Sante. "Maybe 20 minutes, or more." "And when was the last time you saw Monica?" Santi looked expressively at Matt, tearing up again. "When her dad, Mr. Joe, came by and kicked us out," she said. "And that was before the Mexican band." "Maybe she went somewhere else?" asked the second detective, the short, fat one. His appearance was so disgruntled that Mr. This felt like giving him 105 to lighten his mood a little. "The phone was left on the bed," declared Sante with renewed vigor. "And after all, she doesn't go anywhere without her phone." The 2 guards that were on duty outside the guest house didn't see anything suspicious. On behalf of Mr. This, they questioned all the youths and waiters, writing explanatory notes on behalf of everyone. But where had his daughter disappeared to? In her gorgeous dress, no one had noticed. Now the short, fat detective was leafing through the notes, and his disgruntled look grew even more grim. For a moment, the policemen looked at each other and took up their positions beside Mr. This case sucks, said the disgruntled cop, short in stature. "If it's a kidnapping, it's a masterstroke. Hats off, as they say." "Do you think it's funny?" asked Millionaire Mr. Joe. "If it is a crime, do you have any enemies? Do you have ill-wishers? Do you have any idea who might have kidnapped her?" asked the thin and tall Detective Stanley, thoughtfully biting his pencil. "Who?" roared Mr. Matt. "Yes, any cretin who has a desire to become $1 billion or 2 richer, or whatever the usual demands are for kidnappers, daughters, millionaires. Have you been given any demands yet?" Detective Brandon clarified. This bigwig with the loud voice was starting to annoy him. Like a whole bunch of self-righteous assholes, a bunch of them in his precinct. "No, none at all," pulled Matt. "The groom's dead." The cops looked at each other. "Are we having a murder?" asked Stanley. No, waved his hands at the millionaire hobbit morally. "He loves my daughter very much. Was it really painful to look at you?" He sobbed like a girl, trying to tell his side of the story. They'd been dating for 6 months, but they'd only slept together a handful of times. It wasn't the Italian upbringing, it was Monica's nasty temper. "We knew that American women treated flat relationships differently than Italian women. Sleeping with 2 or 3 guys before marriage in the U.S. equated to complete innocence, and his daughter was so caught up in local tradition that she could pass for a Native American woman in terms of sexual freedom. But she preferred to keep you on starvation rations, an approach he understood and even shared." Detective Brendan looked out the window from the 2nd floor of the guest house. There was a stunning view of the courtyard. Beautiful music was playing, some kind of country music. The blue pool rippled in the sunlight. Now I'd like to throw off my jacket, shirt, and pants and dive into this sinful water. And call for the waiter with an ice-cold drink. His partner stood beside him and stared at the courtyard, and stared at the courtyard too. They had been together so long that they had learned to read each other's minds. It caught both of their eyes as a girl with a short haircut, dressed in black pants and a white blouse, bustled about the property. She was rushing only to some guests, who to others, explaining something to them. The detectives looked at each other. "This is your secretary, Mr. Joe," asked Stanley, pointing to the agile girl. "Secretary about it." He hated it when they added all those suffixes and endings to normal male professions. "And don't you dare utter feminism in my house." Stanley was silent. Oh, those rich people, the detective thought. Their own quirks. She's the one who sounded the alarm. "So invite her here," Brenton asked. "And please, let's not waste our time on the subtleties of the English language. We detectives mostly use the unprinted version. But it's not like we brag about it on every corner." The guests had no idea that this was an emergency at the multimillionaire's house. The music continued to play, photographers took pictures, and animators kept the audience entertained. Waiters were passing cold drinks and appetizers. You can't fool these people, though. Successful people have something like a sixth sense that tells them the right decision. The richest and most powerful. They were getting nervous. Being out here in the sun all day wasn't part of their plan. Tony Case, eccentric inventor and billionaire, is already tweeting about it. It's past 12 o'clock. Still no young people. Did he write, "Will there be a wedding today? Will there be a wedding today? Or are we talking about a grand dress rehearsal? A few words for the press," shouted Tony, beckoned the receptionist. "That's my joy. What's all the fuss about? I love tedious waiting, but today it was too tedious." And Mr. Tony shrugged her shoulders. "There's such a thing, you know, such a thing. A life-saving phone call." Mr. It barked into the receiver to urgently go up to the second floor of the guest house. Angie gave Kesa another smile, promised to look into everything, and rushed to her patron. Although the girl wasn't in charge of security and was the first to sound the alarm, she still felt a keen sense of guilt to think Monica was missing. This is a charming and intelligent girl, her bitterest competitors in the fight, and for Mine's, her fiercest rivals in the battle for Mine's attention, it seems to have dissolved. "Mr. Joe," she screamed. "What do we do, Mr. Joe? First, calm down," said it in her steely voice. "Second, listen to these gentlemen. I'll call a council and decide how to proceed with the wedding." The millionaire went into the next room and picked up the telephone. His active soul wanted to move, to investigate, to find out. But he understood nothing of police business. On the contrary, he had always avoided meetings with officers of the law. Of course, he had something to hide from the law and the authorities. But now, alas, he could not do without them. "We'll have to put up with it. This neighborhood is annoying. Shall we split up?" Brandon suggested. "You keep staying at the guest house, and I'll start watching the video. I bet we'll find the answers to any question we want to ask." Stanley nodded his mind. Brenton's is organized in such a way that he's better able to work with a vast array of information. Where the average person would have a stupor, this full-blown detective showed marvels of acumen. The detective went into the next room, where there was a high table, and began to arrange his gadgets on it. "Good idea," Stanley said. All he had to do was talk to Fatty's secretary. The huge leather couch was just the right size for tall Stanley. His feet rested on the ground while he leaned on the backrest, a blissful position for a Russian to sit in. The detective felt that this young beauty with the short haircut could definitely be useful to him. But in what way? "My name is Stanley," he said to the girl, Detective Stanley. "We're investigating the kidnapping of Monica. This simple," she replied. "Call me Angela." "What a rare name," smiled Stan. But the girl didn't react. "So, you were the first to sound the alarm. My partner and I saw through the window how you literally calmed the neighborhood and probably saw all the guests." "That's right," the girl replied. "Mr. Maitredi ordered me to personally check everyone." "Checked," the detective clarified. "At the entrance, I made sure the invitation matched the list. He's a sexist, you know, in a good way. Guests he'll like all those guards he wants. A young girl's a different matter." "Well, there you go." Stanley interrupted her. "Did you see anything suspicious? Maybe some plumbers or alleged police officers entering the house?" "The maid of honor says there was a Mexican concert." "That's the plan," she said. I already gave the band's contacts to the security guard. We booked the Mexicans a month ago. The girl thought there was a lot more to the program. She almost cried. An illusionist, 2 Hollywood actors with small performances, a couple of world stars. It was a shame that all her work had gone to waste. Although, of course, there were other people involved in the organization. Then maybe the detective held out. Maybe you just want to tell me something. Not necessarily something suspicious, something that would help the investigation. Water nodded her head. I have something to say. Just not here. Let's get away from him. Away from who? The detective was surprised. He nodded expressively towards the room where we were also supposed to assemble our council. Yes, Anash whispered. At this time, the master of the mansion was indeed preparing to hold a meeting. In any unclear situation, he arranged for an extended gathering. So how was the kidnapping of his daughter worse? The mother then called the deputies who were also present at Mr. Rinaldi's wedding. Then he thought about it and decided to go to extreme measures, even calling his own wife. Who did I forget? Matt thought to himself. And at that very second, his expensive phone rang. Mr. Joe, Diego Maradona has arrived, reported the head of security. Where are we taking him? Do you have any idea what happened? Screamed the Mata. Yes, the Tom replied without embarrassment. There were rumors that he died. But that's Maradona. How could he miss your daughter's wedding? Tom shouted, it's my daughter who's missing. Missing. Surprised the head of security. Where to, Mr. Joe? I have no idea. The millionaire roared. My daughter's missing. And you're fired. Go to hell out there. Brandon hated working in such an environment of a huge number of people, but most importantly, the snacks and booze that literally dotted all around. And beautiful girls giving him long, piercing stares. The detective yelled at a good dozen guests of employees, while he managed to pull himself together. He seized on his hard drive, videotapes, photos labeled who and which ones he had been given. At this point, a citywide siege plan was put into effect. Dozens of cops were searching cars, combing train stations and airports. Bullshit. He's investigated a dozen kidnappings in his career. The perps always made the same mistake. They talked too much. They'd leave a trail. Brands, like dogs, all that was left was to get that scent and come up with the intruders. Stanley said excitedly as the detective dialed his partner. I think I got it. I got something. You hear that? Let's talk to that uncle again. Early in his career, Brandon had memorized his own cases in great detail. Even a month or two later, he could recite any case, quote interrogation reports and expert testimony. But gradually the cases became similar to each other. In recent years, it was already difficult for him to recall the details of solved crimes. And of all the kidnappings, he could remember only one, which ended in a major failure. However, his fault in what happened was not at all. The boy's parents were reluctant to go to the police. Brenda started looking for the intruders on the 3rd day of the kidnapping, and all he found was a breathless body. Here, look, said Brandon, setting the tablet in front of Matt and Stanley, who came in 5 minutes later. I took a quick look at the videotapes. So our little girl went missing between 17 UI 1730. Let's just say he got it. He suddenly felt old and also devilishly tired. So what of it? Do you know why I thought that? Asked the detective. Because at 16:45 your daughter was caught in the lens of a girlfriend. They took selfies. That matches the explanation of her march. And around 6:00 p.m., you realize she was missing. Half an hour later, we arrived. What was the next thing the millionaire muttered? You want to brag that you're a little good at your job. Not at all, smiled Brandon. I asked you to come here for a minute for a completely different reason. My question is this: who did the dress? Why did such a question arise in the first place? Angry. It's a completely stupid question. Just the way I like it. We're just wasting time arguing, said the detective. But I was gonna show you anyway. Look, don't you find anything odd? Brandon pressed the space bar and the laptop, started playing the video from the surveillance camera installed behind the guest house. It showed a waiter pushing in front of him the very crate in which the bride's dress had been delivered. At some point, he looked away and the Raven detective pressed stop. The face, of course, was problematic to see, but some features could be caught. Stanley snapped a picture of the screen on his phone and stepped aside to send out an orientation. In a strange coincidence, the other cameras in our hero's path didn't work, said Brandon. I told the interrogator to go all the way to the end. He says there's a fire entrance. It's all covered in sidewalk tile. No footprints. It's hard to tell if someone picked the lock or not. Forensics already took samples. See if there's any trace, but I'm guessing it was this waiter who rolled the crate out. It's all right. Mr. Joe, engrossed in his monologue, he didn't notice his companion turned pale. The millionaire kept staring at the freeze frame. He must have listened to the fiery speech too, absorbed in his own thoughts. No way, Mata whispered, clenching his fists. He felt his head begin to spin, as if the car under his control had flipped over and was flying into the abyss. It can't be. Do you know who that is? Asked Stanley. He was watching the millionaire closely. He was also digesting the information he had received 5 minutes ago from Angie. He would have bellowed this. My girl's in mortal danger, detectives. I bet it was my nephew who cut those. Stanley's been working the last few months. He'd already made up his mind to quit the force. And though he was only 37 years old, he'd had enough. His young children were growing up completely autonomous, communicating with their father by phone and correspondence. His wife threw scandals almost every day. And at work, the big bosses clapped him on the shoulders and asked him to stay on for another year, or better yet, 5 more years. Richard Stanley said the chief of police was hesitant to sign his letter of resignation. You're good, you're damn good. Who needs you but us and your family? Answered the detective. Stanley had already decided for himself that as soon as he found the daughter of this thick-skinned man, he would immediately go on vacation and start looking for a job. And he's not going back to the police station. After all, is it his fault that there are so many crimes going on in this city and so few cops who can investigate them quickly and correctly? And do you like your job? Asked the detective, as they walked down the corridors of the guest house. Yes, smiled the girl. It's the best job on earth. I just can't seem to find a man, or at least a boyfriend at Mr. This, you know, has a bad reputation in that regard. Right this way. She opened the door and gestured for me to come inside. She looked carefully to make sure there were no intruders. It's all right. This is where the mops were put. Buckets here stored sponges and other things needed to put things in order. There was a smell of cleaning supplies in the room that the detective liked very much. 2 days ago, some strange people came to see Mr. This said, when they were alone in a room on the first floor. The room was cramped, and there was nowhere to sit down. If he finds out what I told you, he'll be furious, detective. And he'll definitely fire me. You hear that? Where did you go? Stanley asked. To his house. No, we started with our heads again. They didn't go into the house. He talked to them at the guard post. And then one of the guys told me that Mr. Joe took out a whole wad of money and shoved it in their hands. You think? Asked the detective. Do you think he's hiding something? Yes, definitely. Nodded the girl. He knows more than we do, and Monica didn't want this wedding. She told you that? Stanley was surprised. No, we weren't friends. She used to be very jealous of her father. She even threw a couple of tantrums, said we spent too much time together, even alone. What's that? Laughing. The girl shrugged. He likes his daughters to fight for him, by his own helpers. So what makes you think Monica didn't want a wedding? Stanley asked. She had a lover, answered the girl. I can tell you something if it stays between us. You have my word, nodded Stanley. At my request, the Tom was looking after her, said the girl. Monica was meeting this guy in an apartment in the city. He might know the address. Stanley thought that such an outcome would be most curious. The girl had faked her own kidnapping to get money out of her father. But no, it's too complicated. And it's obviously the wrong day. No, all girls want to get married, even if it's the daughters of millionaires. And this pretty girl is probably just jealous of the girl and wants to make sure she's not found. Is that all? Stanley asked. I think this information will help the progress of the investigation. Can I go now? She asked. I think we've worked something out with the wedding. And I need to get back to him so I can be there for him and do what he says. Suddenly, Arsh approached the detective abruptly, took him by the hem of his jacket, leaned over and kissed him gently on the lips and smiled. You're all right, she said playfully and left the room. Stanley was faced with a different task. Renee was literally bursting with pride in her own person. To accomplish such a thing alone. Of course, he'd had help from his brother Jerome, who'd helped get him a waiter at the lavish wedding and provided him with false papers. He hated the Mata family, so he was happy to mess with them. But could Jerome imagine that his brother would risk such a thing? Cousin Giovanni also supported Reen. It was he who helped to push the heavy box into his van and was now driving to the hiding place. But the rest is a solo composition that Reen performed alone. Out of pleasure and joy, he belted out an old Italian song, and Giovanni immediately backed him up with his powerful voice. Without taking his eyes off the road, Reen asked. He couldn't stand it when other men sang along with him. You and I are carrying a very valuable cargo. What's in there? With a gasp, asked Giovanni. Oh, 45 kilograms of pure gold, smiled Rene. He had a reputation as a joker. Therefore, the cousin wrote what he said with a sense of humor. I hope you know what you're doing, said Giovanni, because I'd hate to go back to prison. Don't worry, pronounced Rene. When you find out what kind of scam I pulled, you'll be over the moon. And your young brother will never give you up. You know I'm tough. Besides not being a joker, we all knew about his strong-willed Italian character. Indeed, if he decided to keep quiet, all the police in the world could not get a word out of him. That's why Giovanni decided to help his brother. Besides, if the cops came after him, he could always play the hoser and pretend that he didn't understand the claims at all. Do you really want to know what's in there? Rene asked suddenly. No, I've changed my mind. Laughter. If suddenly Hawaii catches up with me, and I don't know anything. After a year in jail, Giovanni promised himself and his mother to quit crime. He bought an old bus and started hauling freight. The guy loved to work and was ready to spend 14 o'clock a day behind the wheel, which is not typical for Italians. But alas, after the stray criminal money, his income promised to be better. He could even live behind the wheel of his bus, sleep there, and take any job he wanted. It would still only be enough to make ends meet. Reina had given him $300 for an hour's ride, and the Joker clearly had more work to do. If you're really careful, they'll never get caught. Listen, listen, Joe said, keeping his eyes on the road. Maybe you've got a theme in mind. We could play it together and make a big score. But no, brother, said Beggar, pointing to an inconspicuous garage entrance. I'm not into crime. Turning here. You know I have a singing career ahead of me. Soon enough, the whole coast will be talking about me. You'll see and you'll hear. He began to sing another song in his velvet voice. Giovanni envied this young artist. He was really good. And how did he feel about the guitar? Could it be that he had really decided to stick it out to the old folks to get away on stage? And why not? They say that all more or less big American stars used to be backed by the Italian mafia. Together, they gave a guy a gift. They unloaded a large human-sized briefcase and carefully rolled it to the corner of the garage. The guy hugged Giuseppe tightly and gave him a brotherly kiss on both cheeks. The driver wiped a tear that appeared at him from emotion, waved goodbye, and sent. After driving 100 meters away, he jumped out of the cab and returned the real license plates and the stolen ones, on which he had been driving until that moment, He rolled up in a ram's horn and stuck them under the eastern pipe. No dog would ever find them. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Mr. Matta was restless. To think his nephew had cut his way into his wedding and rolled out his personal dress case, most likely with his daughter. There's one question inside, though, that hasn't gone anywhere. How he got her inside. Monica had to fight back. It would have taken a whole gang of kidnappers to break her resistance. How did this young man pulled off such a daring plan all by himself? No, whispered it while pouring whiskey into a huge glass. No, he has accomplices. I will find them. I will find them. And I will make them talk. Whatever it takes. Now, Mr. Rinaldi, Stanley said, looking at the groom's father. Take a good look at this picture. Do you recognize anyone? The detective showed him the image taken from Brendan's laptop. The detective looked at the screen and sighed. I told you, I spoke out of anger, Rinaldi whispered. Let's hire professionals. Let's spend it on security. Let's not waste any time. Stanley asked Monica. It was probably kidnapped. That's for sure, said Rinaldi. If it's a detective case, I'll recognize the valise. It's always carried the dress for our princess. Tell me more about it, Stanley asked. It's quite an expensive dress, explained the groom's father. It requires a special humidity and temperature. This case maintains it. Well, it's kind of like a refrigerator. Could it fit a person inside? I think so, said Rinaldi. Especially if it's a hidden girl. Can the temperature be regulated? Asked Stanley. Of course, nodded the father of the groom, and the humidity. The detective scratched his chin thoughtfully. In another situation, he would have assumed that Rinaldi was involved in the kidnapping, but he had absolutely no motive to commit this crime. Now he and his failed brother-in-law were on display. Let me ask you a personal question, Stanley said. Suppose I'm a kidnapper and I want to put up a ransom for Matt's daughter. How much should I ask for? Between you and me, he's not doing well, Rinaldi said. He's rich in assets, but you can't pull a lot of money out of them overnight. I don't think he can do more than 10 million. Who do you think would want to kidnap the girl? The detective asked. I have no idea. Rinaldi shrugged. One thing I can say for sure, if he didn't think he was smarter than all of us put together, it wouldn't have happened. Anger, longing overwhelmed his soul. Rinaldi didn't feel sorry for the 1 million he'd spent on the wedding, and even the gorgeous dress for Monica, which she clearly didn't deserve. He didn't care at all. Reputation was another matter. Unless this trickster could figure out how to get out of the situation, he needed to be distanced from him immediately. Rinaldi couldn't believe that such a thing was possible in modern America. It seemed that the era of the relationship between Italians was in the distant past. Even his father was no more than a respectable American, much less his son. James held his own in this situation. He was, of course, discouraged by the news that his fiancée had been kidnapped, but he kept his spirits up. Detective, Rinaldi asked, let me ask you a question. What are the chances of finding our beauty alive? And of course, well, it usually takes up to 3 days to solve a kidnapping, Stanley explained. The next limit is a week. If the person is not found within that period, the chances of rescue are close to 0. But pardon me, Rinaldi said. You said but. Yes, nodded the detective. If we're talking about classic kidnappings. But there is a nuance. Nipro claims within 24 hours or immediately after the crime. And here there's silence. It's strange. Looking at the general merriment, it brought tears to my eyes. Annoyed, he walked out into the crowd. After a short meeting with his aides and wife, he had made his decision, and yet he was terribly reluctant to announce it. As much as Mr. Joni would delay this moment, action must be taken. The musicians stopped playing music, all eyes fixed on him. The master of the house. Taking the microphone from the host's hands, he exhaled loudly and said, Dear guests, my favorite close and dear people. Unfortunately, trouble has come to this house instead of a wedding. A murmur ran through the courtyard. Not only the guests, but also the waiters were talking. An impressionable woman fainted and her clumsy husband accidentally broke an expensive champagne flute. "My daughter, Monica," Nestor whispered. "That disappeared for nothing, with no explanation. The police are already working here at the mansion. If any of you are asked any questions, please do not refuse to answer them. Maybe it'll save my little girl's life." "Yes, God bless you all." The homeowner's words had the effect of a bomb going off. Dozens of people immediately rushed to the exit. She used to try to sift out the most high-status and expensive guests to take them out separately. She darted through the crowd, which was becoming less and less organized. Some stepped aside to let the flow past them. The lyricist triumphed, though, getting new information on her phone. What started out as a dreary wedding of millionaires risked turning into a posh report into the story of the 100th anniversary. Basically, she didn't care about Monica's fate if she was raped or killed. It would only spice things up. Of course, such things couldn't be said out loud. But no one forbade her to think a red-hot thought. This story would help her climb to the top of the journalistic Olympus. Getting a foothold in the profession, human reaction helped her. She instantly turned on the photo and video cameras on her phone, instantly typed out the news. Right now, her journalistic flair and a little hint helped her make the only right decision, going to the party disguised as a photographer. She had taken wonderful shots and with complete impunity. Now she had to make the right choice. Most likely, it would be better to hide in the mansion, to hide and listen and see if she could record anything. She'd spotted the cops with her battered eyes earlier. Both Brandon and Stanley were familiar to her. Now the landlord had to talk to the guests again, but this time to receive from them endless wishes of support and offers of help. Powerless and devastated, we shook each hand and endured it, each touch on their own shoulder. The very last man in this mournful procession was the father of the groom. But no words of encouragement were heard from him by Mr. Joe. "If security in this house is so low," Mr. Rinaldi said, "when there's no one else around, should we think of uniting our capitals?" "What are you talking about?" Matt's wheeze wore on a powerful rebuke. He had no more left. "I'm doing everything in my power to find Monica. You're under the impression that she may have faked her own kidnapping," says the estranged relative. He said she wasn't sure how she felt. "How dare he?" Mr. Mata shouted, "My daughter is the cleverest and most beautiful girl. She adores her father, and she adores you too. She wouldn't talk such nonsense. I told him the same thing," Rinaldi replied. But the smile on his face didn't please Mr. Joe. "Did you also tell the kid what it means to lock in a loss? To lock in a loss?" The millionaire questioned Mr. Joe, although he was well aware of such a word combination. How to fix it? Yes, Rinaldi nodded. There was no longer that ingratiating tone in him. It was more confident. "Kid, unlike us, Mr. Joe never went through bankruptcy. That empty feeling when you realize you're left with nothing. But you and I have been through it. Monica's probably his first major loss. I explained to the kid that he needs to get over it." Listen to Rinaldi. Mr. Mata grabbed his visor by the jacket. "We'll find her tomorrow, the day after tomorrow at the latest, and we'll play the Dan wedding. We'll build the whole coast with your skyscrapers. Do you hear, Giuseppe?" Rinaldi said softly, pulling away. "I said fixing the losses with my little boy. He has fully accepted our updated strategy. Together we are going to discover new markets. Nothing personal, just business. Of course, with your abilities, we could accomplish a..." Basically, she didn't care about Monica's fate if she was raped or killed. It would only spice things up. Of course, such things couldn't be said out loud. But no one forbade her to think a red-hot thought. This story would help her climb to the top of the journalistic Olympus. Getting a foothold in the profession, human reaction helped her. She instantly turned on the photo and video cameras on her phone, instantly typed out the news. Right now, her journalistic flair and a little hint helped her make the only right decision, going to the party disguised as a photographer. She had taken wonderful shots and with complete impunity. Now she had to make the right choice. Most likely, it would be better to hide in the mansion, to hide and listen and see if she could record anything. She'd spotted the cops with her battered eyes earlier. Both Brandon and Stanley were familiar to her. Now the landlord had to talk to the guests again, but this time to receive from them endless wishes of support and offers of help. Powerless and devastated, we shook each hand and endured it, each touch on their own shoulder. The very last man in this mournful procession was the father of the groom. Fortunately, he was able to survive that crisis with an extremely broad portfolio of investments. Why did that pinching sense of dread overtake his soul? Now, sitting in the closet was uncomfortable. River was glad he hadn't been tempted to try all those dozens of wines and other beverages the tables at the ceremony were bursting with. Once inside the guest house, she chose the right room and decided to hide there. Finding it wasn't easy, but the landmarks helped. 20 minutes later, she heard a familiar voice. She did. The detectives and I were discussing her daughter's disappearance. Rika surreptitiously turned on the recorder and prepared to listen. One last conversation, and we'll leave you to it, Stanley said. You see, we can't escape the feeling that there's another factor. Did Brandon help him, which you're either hiding from us or deeming irrelevant? I told you where to find her. The Mata roared. Don't you see who's making my whole life go to hell? We can't break into Mister's house, Stanley said calmly, even if his nephew was here, even if he stole the dress case. Besides, Rinaldi had made no claim to the thing. Moreover, Brenton said, it might well have been a distraction. But you must agree, who would draw so much attention to themselves by stealing such a huge structure? It appeared on his forehead again. Those cheeks had already figured out everything, right down to who the ill-fated briefcase belonged to. They'd be looking for his daughter at the same rate. He hated it when anyone taught him how to work, though. Who knows if the esteemed cop is as sentimental about these matters as he is. Let's try to remember, said Detective Stanley in his calm voice. Was there anything strange on the day your daughter went missing or in the days before? Strange. Pulled. There was. Some old woman came by today. Brandon was surprised. What's so strange about it? She talked, said she had some information for me, and she asked for help, said to come down. What did she say? Asked the detective. I have no idea. The millionaire shrugged. I told her to get her out of here. You didn't remember the name, of course, the cop said. Why not? It was desperate for praise, as in the old days, when his every silly joke was met with thunderous laughter. I keep hundreds of names and numbers in my head. Detective. So name it. The name that was just rolling around on my tongue slipped away. The millionaire started snapping his fingers, as if trying to catch the words by their tails. Oh shit. What was his name? I've heard that name before. Disappointed detective tired of waiting for the resurrection in the memory of the cherished last name, and was about to leave the room with his colleague. But in the doorway, Wyatt was called out to them both. Remembered. Excitedly whispered the millionaire. Her name was Mira for the line. That's how she introduced herself when we spoke on the phone, and Anish dialed me. That was at about 4:30 p.m. Gentlemen. You see, I'm not that old yet. That's for sure. Brandon asked, scratching his chin. You're not confusing anything. No, Angry answered we are. I told you, I have an excellent memory. You wanted details. I remembered them. The thing is, said Brandon, I know this woman, or rather these details. Well, then dig, Inspector Dig. Mr. Joe yelled, dig in that direction. Mr. Mehta, tell me honestly, are you kidding me? The journalist became suspicious. The names and surnames spoken up to that point said nothing. But when she heard the Pasolini Prize, the journalist perked up. Could she be the one? Taking out Rick's iPhone, she began to write a short note Tuck sketched. If suddenly now her hunch was confirmed, no need to demand so much from fate. Luck, of course, love's preparation, but also restraint and modesty. The very qualities that Rika could never boast of. The telephone, a journalist's main weapon, thought Rika, trying to stretch her legs. Everything here has cameras to take cool pictures, a notepad to quickly jot down a note. And then there's the internet, where you can always get the information you need. If I didn't know your boss, roared the Matt, I'd call you a puppy, for no one here. No one is allowed to say in my house that I'm bullying. If you're not bullying, that's even worse. The detective hissed. Brendan held back, but with great difficulty. To gain access to Signora, the ruin, you really had to dig. In the truest sense of the word. All because her funeral had taken place 3 weeks ago. Grandma passed away, quietly and peacefully. What can't be said for the valuables that were stored in her vintage apartment? While the old lady waited for her own nameless body to be discovered, someone took everything they could get their hands on. Brandon was on duty when the call came in. This was way out of his league and out of his specialty. After all, burglaries can be handled by rookie cops. They could be investigated by investigators with good agency or serious leads. The brand had a non-trivial reason for such a case. One of the items stolen from the old lady was a real heirloom. You see, Mr. Mehta, said the detective, I don't believe in coincidences, and there are so many in this case, it's sickening. Do you know who Measure is? Of course not. The millionaire waved his hand. I just remembered the name. And that was the name of the grandmother who wanted to see me this morning. What's the matter? You don't see. The world's behind the lines. Passed away some time ago. The old lady was well-to-do, explained the detective. She owned Martha Washington's ring. Quite officially. What's the matter? Are you sick? No. The answer is, Mister, it's paler. I'm fine. These worries are about my daughter and more. So talk to this poor collector. You see, Martha Washington's ring is a real heirloom, said Brandon. Oh, come on, I'm sorry. We're just wasting time. We got work to do. Let's go to the walls. No. Tell me, the millionaire asked. I'm very curious. What's the deal with this ill-fated ring? All right, it won't take long anyway. Brandon waved his hand. That ring is worth an insane amount of money. The entire state police are focused on finding it. Shortly before the mayor's death, the line was going to donate it to the National Museum. It was a long negotiation, but alas, and what are the penalties for a man who stole such a ring? We asked in as calm a voice as possible. I don't know. Probably, shrugged Brandon. I think that the kidnappers simply do not realize what treasure has fallen into his dirty clutches. You see, a trinket like that might be worth 1,010,000 or 20. Yeah, you could get killed for something like that. Mister, this is bad for you. The millionaire collapsed on the floor. Stanley, who had hitherto remained silent, ran up to the millionaire and grabbed him by the shoulders. Took his pulse. Everything was normal. The cops looked at each other. Mr. Jones sat up, rubbing his temples. We need to talk, Mata whispered. No time to talk to my lawyer, Brandon said gruffly. This is your daughter's life we're talking about. If you have something to say, spit it out right now. I saw that ring, said the millionaire. He was terrified that he had brought his daughter to the brink of death himself. Had you seen it? Surprised Detective Brandon. When I bought that ring, Mata whispered. You did, but I had no idea it was stolen. No idea. Then why did you buy it? Asked the cop. Don't you understand? The millionaire waved his hand. If you, like me and my parents, had been in the skin of a migrant, when I got my American passport, I swore that I would never leave this country and I would never cede it to anyone. And the ring of the wife of the first president, Hugo. Stanley smiled. And those, shall we say, antique lovers knew what they were selling you. Yes, they did. Shrugged Mata's shoulders. Oh, shit. I'm the one who told them I was going to give my daughter a gift for her daughter. The detectives looked at each other. Stanley pulled out his phone and started frantically typing something into Messenger. Brandon froze like a dog. He turned his head left and right. Then he signaled his coworker to freeze. Quietly, Slowly, Brandon walked over to the new closet, swung it open. "What a meeting," the girl said, looking at the millionaire. "Glad to meet you. And here I am, hiding from my employer's prying eyes. Who the hell are you?" he roared as he approached her. "I'll throw you out the window." "Don't touch her, Mr. Joe," Stanley warned, grabbing the landlord by the arm. "She's a journalist. Worked for a millionaire. But give me the phone." "Late is late," smiled the girl, showing her iPhone. "Too late, because I already sent the memo. God bless America." This time, Mr. John didn't collapse to the floor, but his face became so pale you could see the patterns of blood vessels on it. America only smiled as she watched him suffer. She loved to watch the masters of life suffer. Brandon hated the press, but he was the one who had been sent in front of the press, and he didn't dare disobey orders. You have to be careful when talking to the media, even if you're leaving the force, and even more careful if you want to stay on the force. Just one wrong word, one joke, and the newspapermen will instantly hoist your detective soul on their free speech pitchforks. "Dear colleagues," said Brandon, "I am invited to make a brief statement. The police are investigating Monica's disappearance. This means a criminal trial. A huge amount of evidence has been analyzed. The department is prepared to pay a reward to anyone who has information of value to us." "Did the kidnappers make demands?" the young journalist asked. She did not identify herself. "No demands," the detective replied. "No reliable information about the details of the kidnapping." "If not a kidnapping, then what is it?" asked the Tolstoy newspaperman, twitching all his chin. "No comment," replied Brandon. He loved that word combination. "Let's say I'm a kidnapper," the young journalist said thoughtfully. "What could I expect? For leniency if you give up the police and fulfill all its requirements," said the detective with a smile. What was happening was beginning to irritate him. "More questions, Mr. Brandon." He heard a familiar voice. "Rika Smith, special correspondent. Do you confirm that there was also a theft of the national relic of Martha Washington's ring?" "I do." Brandon nodded. "But there's no need to sensationalize it. That ring was stolen 3 weeks ago. I personally put the card in the system of search for valuables. Its cultural status is also unconfirmed, since it hasn't been examined by an expert. The rest is just coincidence and your speculation." The detective immediately invited language, but it was too late. The reporters became animated, like an alligator that had been thrown a piece of meat. He saw the newspapermen rush to their gadgets to scribble notes. Not only was a millionaire's daughter missing, but also a very valuable gizmo. Was Mr. Matta involved in the disappearance of this ring? Rika asked. "In the interest of the investigation, this information is confidential," answered Brandon, although he would love to answer the omnipresent journalist indecently. "If you know where the ring is or Monica, let me know," smiled the detective. That phrase was superfluous too. "Mr. Brent, how much could such a ring be worth?" Another reporter blurted out, and the detective decided to take the opportunity to escape. 1000000, if it's real," he answered. "The press conference is over. God bless America and give us all strength." At this time, Mr. This was reading an article about himself, instantly covered in sweat. This journalist had, in fact, still a child completely buried in the ground. Not even the top of his head is sticking out. His daughter's kidnapping had taken a back seat. Turns out all of America is now talking about the millionaire who stole George Washington's ring. Angry comments flooded the newswires. Columnists exercised wit, trying to find ever more caustic language to label his failure. "Gagliano." Mr. whispered it into the phone. "Do I need you urgently? I'm on my way." "Encourage," replied the interlocutor. Gagliano could smell money a mile away. Not every lawyer has that kind of nose. And not everyone knows how to interpret signals correctly. Today, when he first heard that the scandal Gagliano, and immediately canceled all business meetings, postponed them for a week ahead. He went to a restaurant near Mr. Matt's residence and waited for the call. When the driver took him to the mansion, the lawyer asked him to stop at a newsstand. So he bought a fresh press, sat in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce, and began flipping through the pages. Galliano loved the smell of freshly printed newspapers. It took him back to his childhood, when he himself sold the same publications on the streets of New York for $2 a day. That's all in the past now, but the smell of fresh press still lifted his spirits. On the front page, these pages of which were to be adorned with a picture of Joe's daughter, in a gorgeous dress, modeled the headline Millionaire. Tommen, how has the gentleman encroached upon the history of the states? Gagliano read the entire article and noted to himself that there was nothing to latch onto. The entire piece was built on innocent questions and official police reports. The first ring had indeed been stolen. Second, Mr. confirmed this, that the relic passed through his hairy hands. About the excessive vegetation, it's completely true. All mature Italians suffer from it. A millionaire's third daughter is missing, and he gave her rings the day before. As they say, draw your own conclusions. The only thing that caught the eye of an experienced lawyer is the word clip ataman. Galliani knew perfectly well medical diagnosis on the pages of the press cannot be published. And yet this is not enough to nail him and make him apologize. What to say about the small news sites that reprinted the news without looking into the details? It seems that by evening all America knew that it had something to do with the disappearance of some national relic. But the public didn't want to understand the rest of the details. They wanted the hot facts. The lawyer walked through the beautiful courtyard with the traces of the failed wedding. The staff of the entertainment agency was dismantling scenes, unfolding tables, assembling chairs. Guards like soldiers covered every entrance and exit to Mr. This mansion and his guest house. Gagliano nodded to one of them, whose face seemed familiar. But he didn't even see a smile in return. What caught his eye was the automatic pistol that was loaded, placed in a holster. Not one that was prepared for defense. A pass was demanded by the guard. "Gentlemen, this is waiting for me," explained the lawyer, showing his card. "Say Galliano is in place. Expect," ordered the guard and ran to his patron. That one will always be so strict now, Galliani thought, looking around. The guards were giving him unkind looks, and when one of the staff dismantled the scene, approached the mansion, almost beat him. "Where are you going?" angrily asked the hot young man. "Why are you stinking around here?" "I was looking for the restroom," the employee whispered. "What's this? A wedding or a funeral?" Rodriguez shouted. The security guard kicked the underachiever out and blacklisted him. "But I didn't do anything," screamed the hapless entertainment employee. "Let me pack my bags." "You'll get it in the mail," Rodriguez replied. "You're right. The right living his main entrance. Walk faster, or else I'll give you the acceleration now." Galliani, who had been in this hospitable house at the best of times, did not cease to be amazed. First of all, he could not believe that Giuseppe had enemies capable of stealing his daughter. For God's sake, this is America. Here any questions can be settled in court. Secondly, Galliano had never noticed such a huge number of guards. With his experienced eye, he counted 15 men. "Who are you defending yourself against?" "Mr. Galliani," the first guard called out to him, returning from a patron. "Mr. Joe is waiting for you in the library on the second floor. He said you find your own way." "Absolutely." The lawyer nodded and walked past the armed guys. The peaceful man. He hated it when they tried to settle things with guns. The tables inside the house had not yet been dismantled. They were still filled with snacks and drinks, and Galliano couldn't resist a cookie with black caviar. A compact refrigerator and a closet was set up for the treat. The lawyer only had to lift the lid and put the delicacy with a silver spoon. He loved to eat deliciously. Therefore, so many culinary masterpieces made his eyes go wild. Even a sandwich. He went up to the second floor and saw the master of the house. The gentleman was hard to look at. This large, strong man was literally hustling. Bags appeared under his eyes. He was also wiping the sweat from his forehead. Gagliano came up to him and shook his hand warmly. And then they embraced. "I'm sorry, friend," said we. "I'm sorry I didn't invite you to my daughter's wedding." "It's nothing." The lawyer waved his hand. "I think you had enough troubles not to old friends. Besides, I was supposed to have an important meeting tonight, but I canceled it." "I'm in trouble," said the millionaire. Like I didn't hear him. "You must have heard my daughter's missing, right?" "Of course I did," nodded Galliani. "I wanted to tell you right away that all negotiations should be conducted by the police. Alas, it is more difficult to negotiate with criminals than with the most rusty gambler." "No calls yet," Mata sighed. "I called you for another matter." "They can't make a formal charge," the lawyer nodded. He was all too aware of the consequences if the story of this ancient ring did get spun. "We could have this arrested, and not for a token 6 months, but for a considerable period of time. This story with Washington's ring is a nightmare." Galliani said, "Did you do the right thing to call me? You could go to jail for stealing something like that. Certainly a man with Italian roots. But I didn't know." Screaming Giuseppe, "Damn it. There have been so many presidents in the history of this glorious country. How do I know some ring was stolen?" "Take it easy." Joe calmed down. It was Gagliano's lawyer whispering, "I've pulled you out of the sludge before. And this time, I'm asking you to keep your voice down." "That's it," said Joe, lowering his voice 2 times, even quieter. The lawyer asked. Through his channels, he learned that a journalist had infiltrated the house to this, under the guise of a waitress. Of course, letting so many people into his mansion was a huge risk. If he had consulted Galliani, he would have said, "The wedding should be celebrated anywhere but here, away from home." Now he had to be careful. What if another left-wing journalist overheard them? "That's it," whispered the millionaire. "Yes," agreed Galliano perfectly. "Tell me, have you been questioned?" "No," answered it. "There was a conversation with the detective, that's all. The same conversation that this journalist overheard. You see, you have to give a proper statement, don't you?" The lawyer advised me. "Say you were looking for a present for your daughter, and some adventurer offered you Martha Washington's ring, and you bought it out of pure humor for the sake of a joke, thinking that you are acquiring some kind of everywhere face, not a relic. How much did you pay?" 100,000, answered were 100 grand. Galliani shouted, "Oh shit. No, it doesn't work like that. You paid a tenner to a tenner. Got it. Okay." The millionaire nodded. "The main thing is not to forget. Do you think I'll go to jail? If you listen to me, no." The lawyer shrugged. "When you're called in for questioning." "Tomorrow, 2:00 p.m., said we'll go together." "You ask." Gigliano chuckled. "Now you can't even pee without your lawyer. Eh? There's a way to get you out of this, even make you a hero." "How?" asked Matt. He was willing to pay a lot more than the fabulously expensive services of Gagliano to find the ring. The lawyer shrugged. "Do you think that these underachievers can really find your daughter? All rich people are the same," Brandon thought. 2:00 didn't pass before the millionaire called an incredibly expensive lawyer to pretend to solve his issues. And now this parasite from the legal world was calling his detective's personal cell phone. How did he get the number? Of course, a man like that would have to be talked to. Like it or not, there was little desire to do so. Mr. Brandon said with a smile to Galliani, starting into the video call, "I apologize for the distraction. My client and I would like to assist the investigation." "I'm listening." The detective answered only quickly and to the point. "We're still looking for Monica." That's what Mr. Joy wanted to say a few words about. The lawyer smiled. He turned the cameras on the millionaire. "Mister, it's like he's gotten older, hustling." "Detective." Brandon grinned gloatingly to himself. "The rich cry too." "No, they cry when it becomes obvious that money can't buy something. Like going back in time and righting wrongs." The detective said it, but his voice sounded rusty. "Martha Washington's ring, or rather, Allegedly Martha's ring, allegedly Martha. Alleged ring. Stop wasting my time. Brandon exploded. We're not talking off the record here. Anyway, it's a goddamn ring. 2 guys brought it to me, said the millionaire. Tom, the former head of security, set me up with them. I fired him today. Brandon's used to his clients not telling him the truth. But when it comes to his daughter, maybe if he'd gotten this information a few hours ago, they'd have moved forward with the investigation by now. Brand sighed and set his tongues, singing indignation within himself. Already he had said something. What were their names? I really don't know these people's names, Matta said. Real names. We've got to remember something. Brendan exhorted him. They probably know the fate of the ring and your daughter. I saw them for the first time, replied the millionaire. He didn't write the volume. He said that some people wanted to sell me something worthwhile. I don't know why I agreed to this stupid meeting. It wasn't really like that. The head of security told me that a real relic of Martha Washington's ring had surfaced on the black market, and Mr. Matt himself was begging for a meeting to sell it. It seemed to him that if his daughter wore such a ring, not a single person in the whole country would dare to challenge his status as a U.S. citizen. One of them was named Rick, pronounced, "We are Thin Rick." Brandon shrieked. He couldn't hide his excitement. Did you guys really mess with Thin Rick? The detective found it increasingly difficult to refrain from the very unprintable expressions for which his department was famous. Think thin. That man wouldn't miss an opportunity to make a big score, and if we also showed him the money. I can see why the kidnappers didn't make any demands. They could wait days, playing a subtle game with a millionaire. That's all. Brandon asked. Or are there any other juicy details? That's it. Exhaled the millionaire. Please find my daughter. The lawyer turned the camera back to his pretty face. The detective noted to himself that this man didn't care about other people's suffering. He hadn't even changed his face when he'd asked him to find his daughter. And Thin Rick's name didn't make any impression on him. This will make the officer's investigation easier, won't it? Asked Gagliano. Of course, answered Brandon. I'll report everything to the prosecutor. Over and out. Gagliano said he would stay at Matt's mansion as long as necessary. The millionaire thanked for his concern, although he did not believe in its sincerity. However, the presence of an old acquaintance was very useful. Mr. Joe now could not relax for a second and was waiting for new blows. Leaving aside the Italian wine, the maitre d' ordered to serve him a bottle of whiskey. He began to consume this drink to recover a little, and at the same time to calculate the losses. So, the wedding of his daughter did not take place. So we can forget about reaching new financial frontiers. Convert the influence in square kilometers of offices and residential apartments will not work. Speaking of influence, after a series of scathing articles, Mr. Matta will be shunned like a leper. He's seen it here in the West. They called it ostracism, a culture, an abolitionist culture. Luckily for him, he doesn't have to get movie roles or seek contact with the crowd. So he can just leave managerial positions formally and go into the shadows, and from there he can keep pulling strings. Finally, the most important attack is the risk of ending up behind bars. We've been kicking ourselves for telling detectives about the ring without consulting Gagliano. There was no doubt that the whole thing was played by professionals. First, they forced him to buy the ring, taking advantage of his provincial complexes. Then they sent some actress disguised as an old lady. They set it up so he'd kick her out, but he'd remember her name. And then they stole his daughter. The problem is, he's Giuseppe. It's still at the mercy of unknown intruders. For now, he remains a piece on the chessboard. They continue their game and will soon want the prize money. 1,010,000 at least. That's when he'll show them what Italian integrity is all about. He'll agree to any demands, find the money. And then the wheels will turn. Not a single person will be able to avoid answering what he will do with them. Oh, at this time, a gentleman who was far inferior to us in terms of volume and capital structure was drinking whiskey on the same occasion. But unlike Mr. Joe, He was celebrating success, not counting his losses. In just 2 moves, not just to humiliate his opponent, but to destroy him. Of course, not everything went exactly as the calculating Italian had planned. Some points had to be adjusted on the fly. But revenge, the very dish that should be served cold, turned out to be really juicy. Reading the newspaper headlines and angry comments, These reveled in their victory. The only question that kept him on his toes was, where had the girl gone? He had actually thought about her kidnapping, had kept the possibility in his mind all along, and had even embedded his own man in the entourage. However, there's no way for those fools to prove anything. Therefore, Mr. Elizabeth only had to sing along with whiskey, eat pickled olives and laugh, rejoicing in his brilliant plan. He'll find the girl, as long as someone who plays his own game doesn't interfere in this story. The clock struck 12. Stanley and Brendan continued to sit in the office, analyzing the information. The kidnapping required total concentration as the clock ticked down. In such moments of peak time, one descends to the bottom of Maslow's pyramid of needs. After a week of work at the reel, Stanley was ready to sell his soul for a hot shower and a bed with fresh linen. That's the reason he's quitting. And Brandon seemed to be able to endure any hardship, not a man but a machine. He held a complex dialogue with 3 informants at once. This job was like a chess game with several opponents at the same time, and Brendan was nearing the endgame, moving into the endgame. He's about to checkmate and checkmate at the same time. "Bingo!" shouted the detective. "I found her." "Who?" Stanley was surprised. "Our girl," answered Brandon. "But it's gonna cost me a lot of money." "Oh well. Let's get in the transport. We're gonna get her." "Just the 2 of us?" Stanley asked. "Are you crazy? Let's call in a SWAT team for force support. I've got 2 flak jackets in the trunk," Brandon shrugged. "And a shotgun. You can take the helmet if you want." "I'm not going anywhere," Stanley cut him off. "I've already dropped a support request from mine." Brandon smiled. "Or I'll go alone." With those words, he slipped his jacket over his shoulders and rushed out the door. Stanley cursed, put his hat on his head, and ran after him. Brandon, in spite of his stature, was moving very righteously. Stanley rushed after him on his long legs, cursing his partner. "Where'd you get the information?" he asked. "And what's the rush?" "From an informant," answered Brandon. "We got about 20 minutes, no more." The detectives drove through the night city, both the Buick and Brendan literally swallowing up the kilometers. He was accelerating at an obscene speed, and Stanley prayed they didn't hit some pole or manhole. "Where are we going?" Stanley asked. "Let's go easy on the warehouses," Brendan replied. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed his partner patting his pockets. "Did you forget your cell phone?" "Uh-huh," Stanley nodded. "Oh, shit. This is all your fault." "While we were running down the stairs, I dropped the boss," Brandon replied. "Didn't you get Churko off in time?" Stanley was silent. They drove into some kind of industrial development. In the dark, the detective couldn't recognize the place anyway. Brandon turned off the engine. Quietly, without slamming the doors, they walked to the trunk. Brand handed him the body armor helmet and picked up the shotgun himself. "Tell me honestly," Stan said, "what's your deal with the river?" "What?" The detective snapped at him. "Did we come here for the girl or what?" Brandon answered, smiling slyly at the girl. "We're after Warehouse 48. That's what the informant said." Out of the corner of his eye, Brandon saw Stanley slam himself back into his pocket to get his cell phone. The detective smiled. "That's how it is. You live with a man for years, and he's a two-faced rat, ready to sell you out for 30 dimes, or something even cheaper. Didn't you tell the river where we were going to torture our millionaire?" Brandon continued, filling the shotgun with ammo. "She would never have guessed it herself." "Go to hell," said Stanley. "I didn't do anything, and you hid my phone." "I didn't." "No." Brandon smiled, adjusting his armor, which barely fit his large belly. "Just put it in a drawer so you forget it. "And now what?" Stanley asked. "You gonna turn me in?" "No, worse," said his partner. "We find the girl. I'll file a report and go back to your corrupt journalists." He jerked the bolt spectacularly, putting a cartridge in the snick, though the movement was unnecessary. Brandon already knew he wouldn't have to shoot, but he wanted to impress Stanley and show what a beautiful world he was losing. Real male friendship instead of fried facts, instead of stray coins. Something more expensive, a sense of mutual support and respect. "Follow me," Brandon ordered, turning on the flashlight on his shotgun. Together, they stole from around the underground level. Warehouse 48 wasn't hard to find. There was a strip of light shining out from under the door, and someone was playing music inside. Perfect place to rehearse. There was no one around at this time of day. The nearest apartment buildings were miles away. As he got closer and closer to the cherished warehouse, Brandon began to worry that the informant had deceived him. He could hear the gentle strumming of guitars and charming duets of male and female voices. Stanley fell behind. What a rat thought Brendan hadn't even left yet, and already he was starting to care so much about his own ass. The detective crept to the steel door and slipped his finger in the gap between them for a word push and stepped back. The door began to open slowly, as if a gust of wind had propelled it. The voices died down. Brandon heard footsteps from deep inside the warehouse. Someone was coming to close the door. It made sense, and as the man's hand moved out in search of the handle, the detective nimbly grabbed it, twisted, and pulled it toward him. "Handcuffs." "Stan," shouted Brendan. "Stan, handcuffs. Dan you to hell." The clock read 8. Tough morning. Up in bed as early as yesterday. At this time, Mr. Mata thought he was the ruler of the world. He made plans. He was going to grow his capital to obscene levels, and today he's sitting in his underwear on a silk sheet, trying to grasp the shadow of the passing day. So first, let's count the losses. George Rossi called their longtime friendship a mistake and asked not to bother him again. Charles Bianchi publicly disavowed the awarding of a multi-million-dollar contract. Giovanni Greca called to apologize, and for a long 5 minutes told why this conversation would be the last. Luca Moretti ordered a column in 5 leading media outlets on the coast to angrily denounce his former business partner. So it is in all mortal sins, but he had a less than pleasant conversation with Mr. Rinaldi yesterday. Add to that a dozen other, not financial sharks, but a little smaller fish, which yesterday rushed away from him. Yeah, it's time to declare bankruptcy. No, he's got some savings. Enough to live comfortably, enough to travel. He'll have to keep 2 or 3 of the security detail down to the secretary. It's a girl with a funny name of Alex. He liked it, just as long as she doesn't go telling the media about harassment right now. No, she's not. But his biggest loss was Monica, his daughter, his greatest treasure. Still out of reach. What if the mysterious kidnappers found out what relic he gave her and thought the ransom was a lie? Or now they're going to try to screw him over for a sum he doesn't have. There was another possibility. Let the minuscule that the daughter was found just shy of calling early in the morning or did not want to tell the terrible news. Mr. Id remembered that Detective Brenton left his phone and urged to call almost any time of day or night. Well, 800 hours is the legal time to call. He dialed the number, and the cop picked up the phone the second he did. "Did you find my daughter?" "No preamble?" asked Mr. Matt. In just one day he had lost so much of what he held dear. "Yes," answered Brandon, briefly. "Found." Then why did Mr. Mitta whisper, "Why didn't you call?" At 200 hours, you showed up for questioning. The detective was lazy. "That's when you'll find out. She's alive," the millionaire asked fearfully. "Fortunately, yes," replied the detective. No more comments on the phone. The receiver beeped, and the connection was cut off. It threw the expensive phone into the wall in a rage. The iPhone bounced on the parquet and like a frog jumped several times. The screen was covered with a network of cracks. Shouted he, and to me ran. When the frightened girl ran into the bedroom, he said, "Call that rascal. Call him right now." "Wait a minute. Call him. Call him in a few minutes." "Come here, darling. I've got something to do." "I'm listening." Says, "Mister, if I find out it was you who hissed, that's if I find out it was me." Calmly replied my nemesis I. Who else was ever going to hear someone? "If I called you, don't play games with me. You kidnapped my daughter." The millionaire stretched angrily. "You planted that ring on me, but you're like a child. I'm not going to talk to you on the phone. Unlike you, Joe, I know all too well the kind of cells that chatty businessmen go to. If I find out you're the one who whispered it, that you set this whole thing up, oh my God, you really don't know anything." I was surprised. "No," Joe answered, completely confused. "And about my nephew, too?" Asked his date. "No, but then quickly go to the main entrance of your pseudo-American mansion. Come on, let's go before it's too late." And hung up. We thought it would be very Italian to shoot him when he's alone and unprotected in such an open place. But he wasn't afraid of death anymore. Why would he want a world without his daughter? And the capital that made a descendant of immigrants with a family name. That's Mr. He staggered across the courtyard of his mansion. The place hadn't been cleaned up after last night's wedding invasion. There were napkins, plastic bottles, leftover dishes, and engraved spoons lying around. The jam he'd ordered the day before. The guards looked away and pretended to be extremely busy bums. And so he reached the main entrance to his estate, swung open the entry gate, spread his arms out to shout, "Shoot. Well, already I'm all yours." But there was no minibus, not even a scooter where a machine gunner could sit. Only on the grass in front of the gate lay a small box. He picked it up and put it in his pocket, though it might well have been a bomb. He walked back into the house, sat down on the sofa, and opened it. In the box was his daughter's ring, or rather Martha's ring to Washington, and a small letter. The millionaire unfolded it and read it aloud. "And no one kidnapped me. I'm fine. And I'm happy. P.S. Go to hell, bye." After the deafening heat, uncharacteristic of May, flooding the streets of the town with a golden, soulful wave of fresh coolness, coming from the dark gray stone of the Catholic Church, the first of which, as legend had it, was laid by the same architect who had once built Notre Dame de Paris, Stephen was literally dizzy and lingered in the aisle, almost tripped, grasped the back of the pew with his hand, and took a deep breath. "Young man, are you feeling ill?" A certain old woman, Mrs. Justin, ducked out from behind him, looking empathetic and sympathetic. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Stephen forced a smile and stepped back, half a step to let the old lady pass. Mrs. Justine, thanking, levied the case forward, her head in a bonnet. Goose powder and silk ribbon roses bobbed, like a flag sailing a royal frigate. And at last it fell silent as Mrs. Justin sank into a pew in the front row, a seat she had been accustomed to occupy for more than half a century. Stephen settled down in one of the back rows, wrote and was glad that no one was sitting next to him, because right now he was dying to be alone. But he had come to church because he couldn't do otherwise, because otherwise he just couldn't take it anymore. The priest, Father Stewart, appeared up front, and the sermon began. In general, Stephen could not call himself a deeply religious man. To be more precise, he had forgotten the last time he had been in such a place or turned to the Almighty. But today he was in dire need of consolation and absolution, because suddenly everything in his life, seemingly settled and more or less bearable, had gone wrong, and the nightmares of the past, the ones he had hoped had been buried long ago, had returned. They came again, and it would seem that he woke up, washed his face, brushed it off, and lived the whole day easily and happily. But the bad dreams, reminding him of all he had done, came tenaciously, and after them Stephen walked like a man out of his mind, and everything fell out of his hands, and in his head replayed those episodes of reality which he longed to forget. Stephen covered his eyes and folding his hands, tried to listen to what the Holy Father was saying. Not just to listen, but to hear, letting the meaning of each word pass through him. And he was ready to beg anyone, and at any price, if only relief would come, if only they would help him. Stephen did not remember his childhood in Russia. His mother had taken his 3-year-old baby boy and, ignoring the exhortations of relatives, had followed her husband to Ireland. Stephen's father belonged to the Russian community, which seems to have been formed on the Emerald Isle in the 20s of the last century. And then one day, coming as a tourist to his distant ancestor's hometown, he met Adriana. Then he went to Dublin to work, and after a while she announced that she was pregnant. The man was in shock, but did not refuse the family circumstances and began, first, to send money regularly, and secondly, to prepare the papers for the move. And the first memory that was printed in little Stephen's mind was the call home. He cradled the cat so that it blushed the telephone receiver and clapped. "Grandma, I love you. But that's it. That's enough." Mother snatched the receiver from Stephen's hands and, throwing a few angry words into it, hung it up. Somewhere it was like being glued. Next to that memory was another. Stephen playing with a white teddy bear and a fire engine, and then leafing through a book of fairy tales with wonderful and three-dimensional pictures of Ivan the Tsarevich riding a gray wolf through dark forests. All these were gifts to her grandmother from Russia. She never forgot her daughter or her grandson. "I hate you," shouted Stephen in the face of his mother when she announced that she did not. They will not fly to the funeral of grandmother because there is no money. And right on the same day, by the way, Adriana lost all the monthly allowance she received as an unemployed person at the races, and with the second allowance, which was for the child, she bought booze. Bottles clattered on the table, mixed with cans with hidden iron edges and stubble. Canned goods, some of which already smelled bad. Male and husky memorized voices sounded in the room. Mother had visitors again. "We should teach him a lesson." One of the men ventured and tried to grab the 10-year-old by the scruff of the neck. But Stephen dodged and rushed away from the room and the apartment in general with a nose full of tears. And then, sitting on the steps of their brick house, showed himself heartily. He already understood well what death was, and understood even better that now the last and generally the only person dear to him had disappeared. As for his father, he had passed away 4 years after they had moved to Ireland. But Adriana clung to the possibility of living abroad tightly and completely dismissed the possibility of returning home. True, she did not have a good knowledge of the language of indecent profession, but it was possible to receive all sorts of benefits, and the Russian community helped a little. Earlier, the move helped Stephen to adapt rather quickly, learn the language, and generally get into the environment. But at the same time, he also adored his native language and was often sad about the fact that fate had ordered his person in such a way. He often thought that if only his mother had not left, things would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have slept. Would the family have held him back? By the time Stephen turned 16, his mother had gone completely downhill. The boy tried to spend a minimum of time at home, and the place where they lived. Now, it was hard to call home, because after the death of her husband, Adriana sold his small but decent apartment. And with the proceeds of the money, Rats lived in an apartment the size of a room that her mother had bought with the leftovers. And through the paint, you could see the wallpaper that the previous tenants had put up. It must have been in the 30s. "You've ruined my whole life," Stephen had said more than once. But his mother only grinned at him and threatened him with her finger. "Look, I was spinning. And I live abroad. My girlfriends must have been jealous of how they were in our province. I live abroad with my son." That's what my mother used to say. I entered the surrounding space with my hand with such a proud look, as if it was the palace of the Queen of England. At school, Stephen was one of the laggards. He also got mixed up with bad company. But in those years of his youth, these guys seemed cool to him. Outcasts of the common man's society, these obscure rebels. They hung around all day drawing on the walls, composing music or poetry. Stephen realized too late that the police knew his group by name for a reason. This group of honeyed youths from the suburbs were into petty theft. They also stole cars and acted as couriers to deliver things. "Brother, help me out." One night, when the streets are foggy, Stephen asked Jamie for help. The guy from this company can't get busy himself. His girls promised a date, you know. Hand it over. And Jamie handed his comrade a small package. "I can still pay," Jamie added with a pleading tone in his voice, seeing the man's hesitation. "Don't be so forward. There's plenty of money here. Where should I carry it?" Stephen asked. And Jane was terribly relieved, instructed him. But something went wrong. That night, Stephen was apprehended by the police. I mean apprehended. After a heart-pounding, fox-like chase. But Stephen wasn't running from them. He didn't know exactly what he was running from. But he was very scared. As for the arrest, the thing was that a policeman identified Stephen as the man who had removed the car stereo the day before. The teenager was taken to the station. And there, by chance, on the same day, several other gang members were arrested, and those whom he considered his friends willingly told about everything Stephen had done with them. Because in this way, they could at least make amends for their own guilt, showing, so to speak, conscientiousness and willingness to cooperate. And from those conversations, Stephen learned that Jamie had died, hit by a car. Stephen thought it would be all right. He waited for his mother to come and bail him out. She was promised she'd be notified, but no one showed up. And the kid, before he even realized what was happening, he ended up behind bars, in a special facility for juvenile delinquents. And the days flew by. Stephen was shocked, terrified. But, as is typical of human nature, over time, he became accustomed to the circumstances, not just resigning himself to it, getting used to it. And when he was released the day after his 18th birthday, he was confused. What to do now? His mother visited him in prison only once, but not to encourage him, to comfort him. She was interested in one thing, whether Stephen had any stash of something left. And then she said he was an idiot because normal sons take care of their mothers. They're behind bars. She left, and after almost 2 years, Stephen had to go back to their apartment. There was nowhere else to go, so he did. His mother was found on the floor, fallen out of her wheelchair. During this time, she had managed to poison herself with logs, whiskey, broken legs, and was not treated. But despite everything she had been through, she continued to drink. "Sonny's back," Adriana whispered through what was left of her teeth and reached for the bottle. Actually, because she couldn't reach it. That's why she fell over. "Help," she called, looking at the bottle. Mother lifted his mother up, and he almost threw up. He'd met homeless people on the streets, of course. This was how they would live with a cold. The windows closed, the air alcoholic and stinky. There's a mountain of garbage on the floor, leftovers rotting on the table, furniture, appliances, everything that used to be of any value has been sold off. "What is this?" Stephen asked, taking a paper from the table. It was some kind of document, and his heart, a bad feeling. And that's the mother behind him gurgling to suck the leftovers out of the bottle. "A bargain," she laughed. "And I thought nobody wanted our villain." "What are you talking about?" Stephen frowned. This little apartment was certainly not the best real estate in Dublin. It was on the outskirts, in a house that needed renovation. But what Stephen heard next shocked him. It turned out that Adriana had sold some people their only home, sold it supposedly for cash. What had it gone for? Stephen knew exactly. And also for exchanging that apartment for some country house, a cottage in the suburbs. The kid exclaimed, "Mom, are you out of your mind? You can't get that much for our apartment." Well. He nervously leafed through the pages of the confusing contract. In general, Stephen was not a real estate expert, but he realized when he saw the numbers. His mother had sold the apartment for 1/10 of its real value. There was also the address of the new property that these realtors had bought for her. "It's time to move out," he mumbled, but his mother is in a hurry. "They say if I don't eat, the police will come." Stephen was breathing heavily, choking on anger, resentment. He realized his mother had been a victim of fraud, but there was probably nothing he could do about it. "Where are you going?" "Get some groceries." "I'm starving." "Drunk." His mother shouted after him as Stephen jumped out of the apartment. The rest of the day, the guy spent trying to understand the situation at the place specified in the contract, as the address of the office was a small office, where he was told that everything is normal. The deal is fair. And anyway, what claim does the young gentleman have if he had no rights to that housing? When Stephen went to the police, they listened to him carefully and said that they could not help because the deal was legal. "So you can, of course, go to a lawyer," the elderly officer advised. "But take into account the case risks dragging on for years. In addition, it will cost about several tens of 1,000 euros. By evening, it was drizzling rain. Stephen returned home. He realized it was the end, but he was also brutally determined. "Pack up," he told his mother. "I'll take you home." The thing was that on the way back, Stephen had time to find out what was at the address given in the contract. So he made a decision. He helped his mother gather the few things that were left in her pockets. It was empty, which meant there was no money for a cab. They took the bus first. Passengers interceded, fussed. Stephen could understand them. His mother didn't seem to have washed him for a long time. "Hey, let me help you," said a stout-looking man. "Looks like a laborer," and he helped him lower Adriana out of the bus. Stephen thanked him. They walked the rest of the way. Or rather, he walked to break the cauldron ahead. Here, the poor neighborhoods ended and the industrial zone began. And then they were at the city dump. The authorities had long promised to make the place look decent, but they had never gotten around to it. That's why there are a few barracks, built in the 40s for refugees from the continent. 2 of the 3 barracks were completely abandoned, with boarded-up windows and doors. One of them was still alive, where the homeless lived, and there, according to the contract, was Adriana's new accommodation, a room on the first floor with a broken window and a failed floor. There was nothing here, but technically the barracks was still listed on the documents as real estate. "Here we are," Stephen said. He allowed himself a wicked smile as Adriana began to realize how she'd been duped. "Son." The older woman's lips trembled. "How am I here? Don't leave me, son." She reached up to him, her hands all delicately veined, arthritis excluded fingers. "Did you choose this life for yourself?" Stephen's back was turned. "You're not my mother anymore, and I don't care if you die here. You drunk, you creep," he shouted, with a shower of tears, and then, turning around, threw himself away. He didn't care. He did it. Nearly 10 years have passed since that day. Stephen hadn't lived in Dublin for a long time. He had left it, having once bought a bus ticket to the west coast of the island with the money he earned. A lot has happened since then. Stephen worked on fishing boats, worked on a farm growing potatoes and cabbages. He's been a builder, a driver. Basically, he did the best he could. He didn't aspire to anything. He understood that a man, especially if he has nothing behind him, has no family support or financial base, for example, in the form of an inheritance, that such a person should try twice as hard to stand firmly on his feet and not let his life go down the drain. But the years flew by, and Stephen still lived as if today. And so fate brought him to this small resort town. Stephen was not a great fan of classical English and Irish literature, but it seemed to him that it was from such towns that Dickens, Austen, and others had written off the characters for their novels. Time seemed to stand still here, the abundance of greenery, the unhurried rhythm of life. Stephen worked on a construction site, or rather, was among the workers who built the house and had to perform finishing work. Although, in Stephen's opinion, taking into account the size and layout of the house, it turned out to be a whole mansion. Working here was interesting from a professional point of view, as well as profitable. Oh, that. And then clapped Stephen on the shoulder. Suddenly he jumped up, turned around and looked at another worker. "I didn't know you were a believer," Matt remarked. "I just came in for a moment." Stephen smiled guiltily. "I just wanted to, of course. He couldn't say that he had a guilty conscience and felt that he couldn't live another day without taking away his sins, more specifically, his major sin of the past. I understand, Matt nodded. Mine are sick. Corey, can you believe it? I thought they were vaccinated. The mayor complained about his family's difficulties. He and his wife had 5 kids. Mary says it's our punishment for missing Sunday Mass. What can we do? We've got a vegetable garden to plant. You're the one who's been complaining about Matt's life. I was the one who talked him into it. I said, let's not go all the way to town. Let's just do things in the garden. So she agreed. Especially since my average Johnny, he stole watercolor paints and decided to paint his sister's dresses. Can you believe it? Matt choked on the bag, and Mary was washing, ironing, laying out for the girls so the dolls would show up for Mass. So anyway, I sinned and my Mary cursed. Matt sighs. I got it too, says Johnny. All over me. So that's how we didn't go. So why aren't you in your parish? Stephen asked, just to be polite and keep the conversation going, because his thoughts were far away from the story of his acquaintance's life. Well, is it not a good deed? He came in. Can I ask where you live? He doesn't ask, Matt shrugged. It's just that I'm in town all day today. I have to go to the drugstore, then to the supermarket, to the suburbs. I'll be back tonight. I already went to church. That means I did the right thing. Do you think it'll help my family? Matt finished, pathetically. It will, Stephen replied, thinking that it probably wouldn't help him. Or maybe it wouldn't help at all. Some auntie from the front pew spoke up for them and, turning around, flashed her eyes. This isn't your priest. Are you here for the temple? I'm sorry, Matt was making an appearance. He was a master at it. We won't do it again. Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. He, too, would like silence now. That's what he'd come here for. Silence. The priest's voice, his wisdom and prohibition. Stephen was determined to confess that sin today and timidly hoped that maybe he wasn't a particularly religious man, but maybe he wouldn't be denied. Maybe all was not yet lost. Finally, the sermon began. The Holy Father started talking about how harmful it was to spend money carelessly and how it could ruin a person in general. Stephen sighed again with relief. He had feared it would be about something family-related, like how it was wrong to abandon his elderly, sick parents. Stephen had lost track of time. He felt like he'd been here forever. He even started to get annoyed that it was taking so long. He immediately gave himself an imaginary slap for such inappropriate thoughts. But at last the sermon was over, and Stephen began to make his way through the congregation. Everyone was saying a different word to the Holy Father. Do I need to confess? Hotly blurted out Stephen. The imp. Hello. Yes, of course. Stuart raised an eyebrow in surprise, but on the whole was not fazed by the assertion. If you be so kind as to wait for one more person. Okay. Stephen wiped his palms on his pants and sat down in the pew to wait. The church was almost empty. Stephen glanced nervously at the confessionals, wondering if it would be soon. And when the door opened, he jumped up and was about to enter. But a few moments were enough to recognize the man who had come out of the confessional, and for many years Stephen had not thought of him. His brain had discarded his image as unnecessary garbage for lack of use. Now, however, cold as a stormy sea, green eyes, short blonde hair so white it looked gray. But the man was not an old man. He was no more than 30 now. And then, on the night of the crippled man's arrest, barely 20 came out, cast around. A distracted glance passed Stephen, almost hitting him with his shoulder. Not in his eyes, not in his facial expression, not a shadow of recognition. Stephen, on the other hand, recognized it and knew for sure. There was no mistaking it was him. But how? Why? Now that night was printed in memory as an image on the first photographs of the 19th century with time faded, but you can see the important details. And yet it all seems so unreal. Sir, the priest's concerned voice brought him out of his stupor. Stephen shook you badly. You turned pale, added Stuart sympathetically. "Ah, no. Thank you. I'm fine," Stephen muttered. "You seem to want to confess," with a soft, friendly smile. The priest made an inviting gesture with his hand. I, Stephen, did not stop feeling like a great sinner in the blink of an eye. But just now any mood for what I had planned was fading away. "Excuse me, I'll come back later," he muttered, and hurried away from the church to Sun Street, to the air. He urgently needed to get out of the room and into the open. Stephen wandered down the quiet street, where every house was decorated from the front with boxes of flowers and climbing plants, and under the blind of the still sun he sank further and further into the events of that night. He just had to hand over the package. James had given the address and the exact location. He added that the man would come to pick up the package and pay what was due. In the meantime, he gave him an advance. And everything seemed simple. The only unusual thing was that for this Stephen had to turn to an expensive neighborhood of Dublin, where he had never been before. It all seemed an adventure to the young cripple. Jamie said that he was well paid for delivering the shipment, but since he was out of business himself, the money was due to the new courier. That afternoon, Stephen had just had another argument with his mother. She'd blown off what was due on the utility bill, and to relax a little and cheer up, because the matter was murky, he'd stopped at a bar on the way. Stephen saw no contradiction in that. He hated his mother, but he thought he was in control. The only way he could get rid of the alcohol, by the way, was to go to jail, where it wasn't, of course. And in the bar, Stephen ordered the most expensive and strongest drink. He told the bartender, "How old are you, son?" He frowned. "I'm not your son," Stephen muttered and slid a €50 bill. That's the way to go, including bribes. The barman took the money and poured. Then another and another. And when he got to the specified address, Stephen barely kept on his feet. He was confused and almost turned inside out when he realized that in front of him was a cemetery, or rather, the part of it that was melancholically desolate. The sun, meanwhile, had been completely replaced by the moon. The full, milky pale high fence was killed by ivy. And Stephen frowned. There must be a proper entrance here. What would he say, the caretaker? Nothing. It's not a museum. And they don't charge admission. I don't care. Stephen grinned to himself. Maybe he has a grandmother baroness buried here. But it was too lazy to look for the gate. But there was a hole in the fence. In one place, the bars must have fallen out from rust. Stephen was a teenager then, so it was easy to fit through the hole. He looked at his watch. It was still an hour before the appointed time. Well, that's just it, he decided. I'll wait. A cool breeze and a special atmosphere. All these crypts, the statues of angels who seemed to be watching him, all this would sober Stephen up. He was tense and confused, because it suddenly became so nauseating to wait there, in the agreed place, under a huge oak tree, and because there too stood the statue of an angel. He was dropping tears and reaching out his stone hands to someone. Stephen would not let go. The stupid thought that if he turned away for a moment, the statue might come to life, throw itself at him, because he wasn't a very nice person, was he? Vaughn noted another drinking buddy of his mother the other day and whistled after the girls in short skirts, and he disturbed the eternal peace of ladies and gentlemen. So Stephen wandered away, decided that he would walk a little way and come back. He had sobered up, and now he was gnawing with curiosity. What was he handing over for a few €1,000? Certainly not a love note. His fingers took the roll out of his pocket and unwrapped it. Under the dirty cloth was a scrap of newspaper, in which was wrapped a wooden polyhedron covered with strange golden squiggles. It looked like a puzzle. The miniature box with the secret. Stephen began to twirl something in his fingers. What was it? His fiddling with the strange object was interrupted by a strange sound. In fact, it had been heard for about 5 minutes. But at first Stephen had thought it was a night bird. But now it must be because he had gone further into the cemetery. He realized it wasn't a bird or the wind. It was a voice. It sounded like a man reciting poetry. Only it sounded animalistic. It was like a chaotic jumble of separate words, And yet Stephen could swear to it. There was a certain order to it. It was like a song or a spell of dark magic. I'm surprised at the nonsense that comes to mind. The courier began to hastily pack the wooden something back, but somehow he accidentally pressed on the wooden edges, and they opened with a quiet click, revealing a black gut, and in it shone a diamond. Stephen had never seen a real diamond in his life, but he guessed it at once. And although he had never suspected in himself such a craving for beauty, he found himself infected by the pure radiance, like the light of stars in the game of multicolored sparks. The stone was large, even by the standards of gems, huge, and it was scary to imagine how much it was worth. Stephen realized he was holding his breath only when his chest ached and his eyes darkened. The smell of bodies, bread and nervous air. And he started to close the secret box. There was no need to guess. Decent people don't pass gems with boys from the poorer parts of Dublin. So the stones are stolen. Stephen, of course, had been in many stories in his life, but he had never been involved in outright criminality. The strange noises subsided, and at the same time he realized he was no longer alone in the cemetery. He was just lucky he was standing behind another statue, not of an angel, but of a huge dog. Apparently, some rich aristocrat had decided to bury his favorite dog here with honors. Kostya sat down, because a figure separated from the nearest crypt under the creak of closing doors and floated along the path. He could not see the face or the body. Everything was hidden. A floor-length and dark cloak in a hand, draped in a dark glove, swayed an antique-looking oil lamp. Stephen crouched down, clutching at the cold stone in his gut that on no account should he be seen. And when he peered out cautiously, the figure was already melting into the distance. Stephen wiped his forehead, cold sweat coming out. He felt like a character in a Hollywood thriller. "What kind of day is yours?" the guy noted. "Ours." There were almost 40 minutes left till the meeting with the mysterious recipient of the cargo. "We have to wait." But Olga was now gnawing with curiosity. And what was that strange person doing in the crypt? There was definitely a mystery here, and Stephen wanted to solve it. That's why he went to the crypt. "I'll just take one look," the boy promised himself. The heavy door was ajar. Turning on the flashlight on his phone, Stephen dedicated the top. O'Neill read the letters embossed above the crypt entrance, and he realized it was the last name of the family members lying here. Thoughts popped into his head about how there must be a lot of germs in here. Stephen's first teacher, Miss Charlotte Lewis, hated two things: dirty and lack of discipline. The latter was dealt with by the use of a pointer, under which the offenders had to put their palms under. Stephen learned about the fact that children should not be beaten, by the way, only at the age of 13, when the school scandal broke out because of Mrs. Lewis. And for the first, this teacher had hundreds of stories in the style of that one boy ate unwashed apricots and died, and another stroked a stray dog and went blind. "It's a good thing you're not around." Ms. Lewis grinned. To encourage herself, Stephen and stepped into the crypt. Silence. Emptiness. Except for the burials. "Well, what else did you expect, you idiot?" He was about to leave when he realized there was another door in the back of the building. "There must be mice or rats in there. Please let it be rats," Stephen pleaded to himself, because something was making noises. A couple of steps, peering in, devoted to the phones. Sarcophagus on a pedestal, white marble. The lid was made by a skilled craftsman. It depicts a sleeping warrior with sword in hand. "Is anyone alive?" Stephen asked. I wondered why his voice had dropped. "Fear, I suppose." "Oh, that's creepy." But he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. No one answered. So the strange sound must have been imagined. Boom. Luckily, it didn't hit inside the crypt, but outside. A sudden thunderstorm had begun. Stephen jumped up, dropped the phone, which bounced off the corner of the sarcophagus and fell behind it. It was brand new. I'd been saving up for it for 6 months. Where could I get a new one? However, if someone reminded himself Stephen did not behave like an idiot and quietly waited for the client, it was possible to buy a new smartphone with payment. Now it would be impossible to miss the customer at all. What time is it? Does not enter the crypt of poisonous vipers. Thoughts were racing, and not at once Stephen made out what was going on above him. Now there were sounds coming from the crypt itself and from the sarcophagus. It seemed as if someone was lurking there. The scraping was accompanied by a groaning that made the blood freeze in the veins. Earlier, when Stephen sometimes watched horror movies, he used to marvel at how stupidly their characters behaved. But he himself was no better. Instead of picking up the phone and running away, he spread out and stared at the sarcophagus. It appeared as if its lid had shifted. No, it had been lying ever so slightly crooked all along. On an impulse, Stephen began to move it to the side. Then he shone the light directly into the sarcophagus, and what he saw he could not forget. Actually, it was because of what he saw that Stephen went on a panic run, in which he dropped the diamond, dropped the box, and then, in shock, flew out into the streets of the suburbs and ran into a police patrol. He burst into tears like a little boy. And when the officer recognized him as a thief, he did not resist and only nodded in response to the words that "You will go, boy, with us to the station, and there is safe." And from nerves, Stephen asked. The two patrolmen looked at each other. Yes, where else but there? The younger one answered, "You all right? Are you feeling okay?" "No," answered Stephen. "I don't know. Please save me." The teenager turned up his nose. The flashlight beam, faint but piercing, bright for this time of day, revealed a scene in which nightmare was strangely combined with Gothic aesthetics. True, Stephen hadn't thought about it at the time. His brain just absorbed what he saw and signaled it. "We're in trouble. Let's run and see if it catches up with us." There was something lying among the sweet-scented snow-white lilies. Stephen at first thought it was a sculpture. He saw the tall features of a face made of marble, and part of the face was hidden. On the head of the one lying there was a helmet gilded, or perhaps gold. His attention, however, focused on something else. A few seconds passed, and it came to Stephen's attention. No, it was not a statue, but a man. Another wave of cold fake sweat. It trickled from between his shoulder blades. Had the bartender stirred in the last cocktail? Stephen pressed his palm to his stomach. The syrup was sweet. Cream, tomato juice. But the whiskey made a nasty mess too. Alcohol's evil. Consciousness prompted again. Maybe he'd passed out and was sleeping under a bush. Or maybe it is white fever begins. What are its symptoms? And then Stephen decided to check it out. That's a real person lying there. It's just the way he looked. I mean, it was like he was too perfect. Poor thing, Stephen thought. Must have died young. It's not the money that makes you happy, so it's better to be poor but alive. He reached for the body where the hands with gold rings were folded on the chest. The fingers clutched the hilt of an ancient sword. A strange sight for sure. It seems that in the olden days, warriors were placed in mounds with all sorts of bling. But it's fresh. Stephen took a noisy gulp of air, and his stomach seemed to settle down. The palm of the boy's hand went down to the chest of the one who lay in the sarcophagus. It was cold. Or was it the clothes? A strange leather jacket like the ones they wore in the olden days was freezing. It's a cold night. Wait, why is a modern man dressed like that? That's for sure. The rich have their quirks. Stephen, it's silly to giggle, because his buddies will be shocked when he tells them. It's not like drawing pictures on the wall of City Hall. Who's gonna believe him, though? I'll take one ring. What does he care? Stephen muttered and grabbed the man's hand. And the next moment, Stephen suddenly met his gaze with green eyes. His heart sank, his body stiffened as much as the one lying there. And then the one lying down smiled, contrite, and sat up abruptly. Stephen's wrist was in the grip of icy fingers. Green eyes turned, and from the mouth came the hiss, or rather the warning roar of a beast ready to attack. In the next instant, Stephen wailed from staggered. He lashed out and turned and flung himself away. Rather, the bushes whipped. Spit in the face. He twisted his leg. I don't care. just to get away. It's spurring me on. Intoxication. Stephen just flew forward. He didn't stop, even though his lungs were burning with fire. Doing what? What's following his trail? He's from a sarcophagus that flies. Maybe he's already grown wings and will crash down from above. Stephen sobs, so he sped up. And then there was the street, the police patrol, and the arrest. Apparently, he looked really bad because at the station, before locking him behind bars, in his cell, the policeman who had inquired about his well-being gave him coffee and fed him donuts. Stephen swallowed it all and went into withdrawal. He confessed to stealing the tape recorder, and then didn't really give much credit for other things. Hooliganism, insulting authority figures, shoplifting, usually chocolate bars and potato chips. But he flatly refused to talk about why he'd been scared and what he'd asked to be rescued from. But because he didn't want to be sent to a mental institution. And then he'd probably have to tell about the diamond too. And that Stephen was a freak. It's a real mess. How many years has it been since then? And then in broad daylight, miles away from Dublin, and in a church in a place like this, he met this man. Same eyes, same nose shape. 10 years on, but Stephen would have sworn it was him. It only created more confusion in his mind, though. No, as time went on, the guy stopped thinking he'd stumbled upon a real vampire or some other ghost. That's bullshit. There's no such thing. There's got to be a rational explanation for everything. And then, over the years, this episode went, as they say, to the farthest shelf in the vault of memory. But still, now the memory is refreshed, as if it happened yesterday. And I should be glad. It turns out there was definitely a man in the crypt, but something was bothering me. It was as if seeing him was an omen. Stephen didn't realize how he'd gotten home. It's called a footstep. Before everything went wrong, he'd thought he'd be able to relax a little on his legal day off. After he gets some help at church, that's how it works, right? After that, he wouldn't go to the pub for a drink. He's been out of that for a while. Ever since that day. But the pub was the best place to get the best. Chicken fried wings, perhaps. Stephen was going to have a bite of that. But now, of course, he didn't go. He lay on the bed, not developing. Stupidly did not care about the cleanliness of the house, was just lazy. But by evening and the stomach demanding sounded. And had to go to the kitchen, where he ate what piled up in the freezer instant macaroni and cheese for the microwave. And then already separated in wall in his outer clothes with pants to sleep. And what luck that there were no dreams tonight. What are you like? Matt asked the next day. You'd think you were dancing with the elves all night, not sleeping, wouldn't you? The friend grinned. Matt, like many locals, was quite serious about the little people, with whom, according to Irish mythology, both elves and creatures, medium between trolls and dwarves, were related. Or maybe Matt was playing with his eyebrows. You didn't get enough sleep, pretty girl. Stephen let the horseshoe pass not only in his ears, but also in the ears of the other bachelors at the firm. There was a perception that Matt had been pregnant again since finding personal marital bliss with the graying of his Mary's benches. We've been doing it ever since and trying to set others on the same path. It's just been that kind of day. Listen, let's get down to business, or we won't be able to do it until New Year's Eve, Stephen replied. But it must have sounded a little rude, because Matt chirped and, grabbing the creamery materials, moved to the other end of the room. The sun was hiding behind the clouds on the seaside today, and the wind was coming in gusts. All in all, the weather was just right for hard work. Excuse me, a ringing maiden's voice brought Stephen out of his musings. In spite of the further heavy thinking, he was distracted by the yesterday's meeting, and even smiled involuntarily. I ordered a pizza for lunch, Tessa said, fixing her red curls that had been knocked out of her neck by the wind. And they told me they were having a promotion in 2 at the same time. So maybe you boys would like some pizza too. Pizza's a good thing. Murdoch's all fired up. Oldest guy on the team. A jack of all trades, he said he'd work for another year and retire to live on the beach with his wife. devoting himself to fishing. T. O'Neill, 26, single, not in a committed relationship, orphan, but has an older brother with whom they live together. She is an interior designer by profession and calls this house her best and most important project. Loves Italian cuisine, loves to dance. Dreams of having a street Bernard. Can't stand dirty jokes. All this information Stephen didn't collect, but it was dumped on him by Matt. And Stephen had a suspicion that someone was trying to take on the role of matchmaker. Except it was no use. No, in theory, he recognized that Tessa O'Neill was a very attractive girl. They say she has natural beauty and a striking liveliness of disposition. She had waist-length red hair and freckles to match. Now in spring on the face brightness, as if opened on the forest edge, the first flowers. Tall height and slender figure with feminine forms. TLC is most often seen in dresses, flying skirts. She is so romantic. It was also known that Tessa's parents left her and her brother a decent inheritance, but she is not Matt at resorts and parties, and learned and works hard. Also supports the local animal shelter for homeless animals. Good girl. Never thought about hopping in a cab though. What the hell? They belong to different worlds, don't they? He's a loser, a 30-year-old man without a corner of his own, and with such moral baggage that if he'd lived like this 300 years ago, he would have been banished from the city gates. In general, Stephen kept his distance. Even in his mind, almost always succeeded. However, that didn't stop him from admiring, of course. Ms. O'Neill in theory. The break with pizza had a beneficial effect, and after it the work boiled over with redoubled vigor. God willing, we'll be done by next weekend, Murdoch said, arching his back. Stephen nodded. The work was really coming to an end. It was time to wallpaper and install the outlets, and then they could turn in the project and get an estimate. And Mrs. O'Neill would no longer loom before his eyes. An unhappy thought came to his brain. Stephen mentally slapped himself on the back. You're thinking about the wrong thing. It's time to settle down. Somewhere he was tired of wandering around Ireland and living in the present day. Wanted stability, wanted to put down roots. Maybe it would keep him from the pain of the past. At last it was quite evening. The workers were leaving, but Stephen was still lingering. He stood on the veranda and the second floor of the house, from which he had an impressive view of the coast. Light-colored sand, tall grasses. The wind almost always blew here, and it must be fresh here, even on the hottest day. Stephen ran his palm over the smooth, dark wood. The top of the veranda fence was made of it, and the wall of the house on this side, where the spacious living room was. There were 3 of them in the house, and they were all glass. Suddenly, an image flashed in my mind of a weekend table for the whole family in this living room. A young woman like Tessa. Of course, one day she'll have beautiful children. And her husband. He's got to be a real man. He's got to be a real man. He's got to carry her around and never hurt her. He certainly shouldn't be like me. Stephen grinned bitterly, thinking that he himself had as much chance of having a normal family as of going to the moon. Because somehow, since his youth, life had gone wrong. And what good can come from that? Today's a good day, isn't it? TPP appeared on the veranda so suddenly that Stephen flinched. She stopped a step away from him, resting her hands on the railing. The wind flew in powerful gusts and ruffled her long new skirt. A snow-white tank top was tucked beneath a cashmere cardigan, and Stephen hastily averted his gaze from the seductive forms. Got himself a freak, thought he, angrily. A girl like that would never look at someone like you. Tessa started a conversation about what remained to be done in the house, and Stephen agreed that yes, it was probably not too late to make changes to the skirting boards. But of course, that would have to be reflected in the estimate and so on. But I think I'll go, he said, glancing at his watch, as if he had somewhere to go. But he just realized he had to go. Oh, I've totally lost you guys. Tessa laughed and deftly twisted her hair into a tangle. She intercepted the silk elastic band with pearls that had been dangling from her wrist as a bracelet. The wind picked up even more. And now even the seagulls flying over the coast were noticeably flapping in its gusts. "No, it's all right," Stephen smiled embarrassedly. "It's just that you probably have a lot of plans for the evening. We're all about business." "Well, I'm not really doing anything tonight," Tessa shrugged. "My brother will be busy with our shields, and I'll probably just watch a comedy movie," suggested Stephen. "No," shook her head at Tessa, and the pearl earrings on the long chain swayed in time with her movement. "Melodrama. I want something about love." "I see," Stephen mumbled, and for some reason got busy with the coloring. Then he decided it was time to leave. He went down to the first floor, and already at the front door, he realized that something was missing. Of course. And the toolbox is an idiot. A brand new set that had cost him almost 400 euros. Could have cost less, but it was a good set, and with a lot of useful things for a builder of repairmen who wants to work in tone with modern technology. Could have picked it up tomorrow, of course. It wouldn't have gone anywhere overnight from the house. But Stephen had a thing for keeping all his stuff with him and in neat order. So he made his way to the room where they worked. Tessa seemed to be planning to set up a guest room here tonight. Stephen, if it were his house, would have used it for a home library or nursery, because the windows looked out onto the garden. On the first floor of the house, the lights were off everywhere except the hallway. But basically the night was cloudless, and the moon was full, so there was visibility. As Stephen entered the room, he bumped into someone. And it wasn't Tessa, and the moon was just across the window, so he could see who was in front of him, and it was the one with the wine eyes, and the type. Stephen froze. The guy froze, too, and the eyes in his face became like black holes. It seemed that he was about to grin his face and let out a trumpeting animal roar. But instead, the one who stood opposite only exhaled in astonishment. "You are not Yura," answered the seated voice Stephen, and paid the price. On the plus side, the fact that he had met his past at all was a plus. Now it was clear that in front of him was a living person, which meant that he then did not catch a hallucination of a rebellious ancient knight. But the minus also outweighed it. This person also remembered everything, and was just furious and stepped on with a very bad look. "I wonder," thought the heavies. "Stephen, why is he angry? That you disturbed his peace. What the hell was going on in there? Where's the stone?" A stranger from the past grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, pulling him closer. "Where's my diamond? And the precious gem?" Stephen, of course, remembered after the arrest, and more than once, but thought that since it was not possible to pass on, it would be better for him to keep quiet, so as not to get even more trouble. "So it's yours. What is it?" "I don't know. I lost it." The green eyes didn't believe him. "Where's the diamond? Tell me." "Or what?" Stephen felt an inappropriate sense of humor. "I don't see a sword on you." The next moment he saw it thrown before his eyes by some dexterous trick at the door leading to the lower terrace. The blow knocked out his breath. In this part of the house it was necessary to remove the finished floor at the last moment in order to get to the wrongly laid communications. What was the other firm doing anyway? And Stephen was unlucky. Collapsed right into the hole. But lucky too, because his back hit the smooth, not the pipes. He didn't move much. No, I don't think his spine's broken. You know, it's just luck. Green eyes, and who's clearly used to solving problems with his fists, also ended up in a hole. And he's hovering over Stephen again. We were wondering what idiot the courier handed the shipment to. Couldn't find it. And then the dumbass died. Jamie's mind was moving the gloomy little man. "I guess did you kill him?" Green Eye's eyebrows crept upward in surprise. "Why?" "No, he was an asshole, crossing the road where he shouldn't. He didn't have time to tell me exactly who he gave the stone to. But now I remember the face. There was no one else at the cemetery that night." "So where is it?" "I don't know. Stephen's in my clutches and grip. I never thought of myself as a weakling, but there was nothing I could do against this type, and he suppressed not only physically, but as if he radiated energy of danger, cruelty. That's how the rival stretched out and suddenly smiled, as if he remembered something. He looked around at the whole construction pit. And you know, in the olden days, that the house stood centuries, and for good luck the foundation was taken. Zamulia sacrifice. When the rooster animal what? But human sacrifice is best. So maybe since you're so useless, you've forgotten everything. So unlucky. It's worth leaving you here, you psycho, whispered Stephen. And then suddenly he learned evil and charged upward with his knee. Gotcha. Green eyes lined up, and with a lingering sideways glance the enemy collapsed. Stephen, with the trot of a frog, climbed out of the hole. Purely masculine. He understood that mean blow. Really painful beyond belief. What's going on here? There was a worried voice. Tessa had turned on the light in the room and now looked out onto the veranda, frowned when he saw the head of the man in the hole behind Stephen. Kirk, what are you doing there? We need to call the police. Stephen blurted out. That psycho snuck into the house and... That's my brother, exclaimed Tessa, and rushed to the hole from which Zeal, obviously still in pain, was climbing out. What the hell is going on here? Stephen stood in shock. This psychopath is Tessa's brother. In general, the girl told herself a lot about him, Tala, about how kind, wonderful he was, how after the death of her parents he took care of her, and for her sake he gave up his career as a detective, took over the family business. Both that man and this one couldn't be the same person. I'm fine, Kirk muttered. And the windpipe is all over the construction dust. Tessa, who is this guy, and how did he end up in our house? Him. The girl looked at them in turn. Stephen the builder, he works here. For a few minutes there was silence around the little company. The only sounds were the sound of the surf in the distance and the singing of a bird in the garden. Yes, Patrice nods flowers. The girl exhaled. The test had taken place. Stale and masking whiskey. How about we drink tea and talk quietly about everything? Judging by Kirk's face, to speak now he would prefer the last word over his opponent. But Stephen decided that to spite this man, who by his face and first impression would play villains in Hollywood action movies, he would keep peace for Tessa's sake. They went into the kitchen, and this room was the first to be finished and arranged as it should be. That was what the thoughtful Tessa had decided, and so now it was quite cozy. The girl piled tea, took out sandwiches and cakes from the refrigerator, put cookies on the table, and offered to have a snack. But her offer was ignored. Boys are boys, she grinned. Take a seat between her brother and Stephen, who looked at each other without even thinking, drawn to the drinks and food. So, what are you two fighting about? He stole our diamond, Kirk said flatly. No, he didn't. I dropped it or something, shrugged Stephen. Who stole it? What are you talking about? Asked Kirk. Is it fair to pass on jewelry like that with a guy from the suburbs? Like it's something criminal? Stephen made a logical argument. Or am I missing something? You don't have to understand. We should have just handed over our damn diamond. Kirk stepped forward. It seemed that in a moment he would jump up on the table and throw himself at his opponent. Maybe then we should have gone out after him, as we had agreed with the courier. Stephen raised an eyebrow expressively. Not lying in the crypt. What was that all about? What if I had a weak heart? What's this masquerade anyway? Where's the diamond? You expect me to believe anything you say. You know, when I first asked about it, I could tell you knew what I was talking about. So you stuck your nose in what you were asked to tell me. You think it's okay to be curious. And you expect me to believe that when you saw the jewelry, you didn't run away with it. I did. Kirk grinned. How convenient, and there's no proof. You, by the way, tried to take the ring off me in the crypt. I'd been drinking, and I felt awfully awkward. I was drunk. That's great. I think I'm starting to believe that a drunken idiot could actually lose what was entrusted to him. But how do you explain what? All right, stop. You're standing up, spreading your arms like a referee in a boxing ring. It seems we need to clear something up, and for that everyone needs to calm down. I am calm, Kirk muttered, but sat back down and even drank his tea defiantly. Petrus spoke up, addressing Stephen. After their parents died in a car accident, it was just the two of them. She was 15, he was 18. Her father owned a large firm involved in the production and sale of automobile fuel. Kirk had hastily taken over the board of directors, although it had previously been assumed that Tracy would be the one to move into the family business because her brother had chosen a different vocation. But Tessa was still too young, and Kirk decided to postpone the dream. Relatives, of course, existed, but theoretically, because the father of the brother and sister had long ago cut all ties with most of them. The head of the family, Mr. John O'Neill, was also a passionate collector of precious and semi-precious stones. His last acquisition was a diamond from India, a unique stone of pink hue, which had a rich history and was shrouded in legends. It was not easy to get it. There was a fierce battle at the auction, and not only in the bids. There were attempts to bribe its organizers as well. John O'Neill won, but on the way, when the stone was in Istanbul, it was stolen, and it turned out that it was done by an old friend of the men's private club, Mr. Albert Free. Of course, O'Neill's lawyers were ready to take up the case, but John feared that Albert had decided to cover his tracks and hide the diamond somewhere irretrievably. Then he came upon members of a gang in Dublin, among whom were first-class thieves. They took the order and executed it brilliantly. But John did not have time to return his treasure. He and Number Kirk, who knew the whole story, had to eventually take care of the precious piece of his father's collection. The stone was to be delivered by one of the gang members, and it was Jamie. Yeah, well, the guy decided to take the case. I see, said Stephen. Well, he thought it was a criminal case. Turns out it was. Well, it wasn't exactly legal either, but he could understand Kirk. Now there was one more detail. What the hell was Kirk doing in the crypt? I could say it's none of your business, Tissa's brother replied. It's our family's. Kirk, please. Tissa soothingly covered his hand with her fingers. I realize almost no one knew about this, but I think he can be trusted. Kirk reddened his face, threw from Papeliev an extremely suspicious glance at Stephen, but nodded silently and spoke. John O'Neill was not the kind of man who made himself. The family's wealth had been handed down from generation to generation, and almost all the ancestors in the family believed it was for a reason. According to legend, success and prosperity were granted to the first member of the family, Sturhepnu, about 500 years ago, when a brave warrior was lucky enough to capture and take Princess Mary as his wife. And since then, for each man of the O'Neill family, when the time came for him to inherit after the death of the head of the family, it was his turn to undergo a kind of initiation and test at the same time. The essence of it was that a man had to put on a gilded helmet and take a sword, and also put on rings. Both, as the legend said, belonged to the same tribe. The heir also had to put on a shroud and spend the night in the crypt. And not just any night. He had to spend it in an empty sarcophagus that was meant for him in the future. Yes, that was the tradition. When a boy was born, a sarcophagus was ordered for his future, the same size as a grown man. By the way, it was believed that it would deceive the evil forces, and in infancy, childhood, the heir would not die. Kirk grimly explained an important detail of the sinister ritual. But it is necessary not just to lie down, but to sleep. That's why they also drink a decoction of herbs. Is it a sedative and a sedative? He grinned. You know, it's a very stressful environment. Stephen listened to this almost with a high jaw. So much for aristocratic family traditions. Creepy, isn't it? I must have had too little to drink. Kirk shrugged. I had nightmares, and I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. But then when you touched me, I woke up. Scared you. Scared myself, he answered for the first time, without malice, with a chuckle. I didn't realize who you were at first. I thought maybe Tomb Raiders. Who was that figure? I saw a man in a cloak come out of the crypt, Stephen said. That's why I thought I'd come in. It was me, Tessa sighed. You were a bit of a shock, Stephen, For a 15-year-old girl to be involved in something like that. What was I supposed to do? I shrugged. We had to honor tradition, but you were alone. I'm sorry, but who would blame you if you didn't do it? No one. Tessa agreed, but we couldn't insult Father's memory. She looked fondly at Kirk. I couldn't leave my brother alone. I had to be there in case anything went wrong. Of course you did. Stephen was confused. So since he was supposed to be asleep, that's what Diamond was supposed to take him? Yes, she nodded. I was going to wait in the car, then pick up Diamond and wait for him to wake up again. But then I heard my brother's voice, and I didn't see you running away. Kirk woke up. He wasn't feeling well. We came home, called the family doctor. It seems we didn't prepare the potion correctly. Stephen thought that personally he would not have been forced by any family honor. The memory of his ancestors to sleep in a tomb and drink a potion of unknown herbs according to the recipes of ancient witches. More tea, perhaps? Tessa suggested, and without waiting for an answer, jumped up from the table behind. I was in the kitchen. So you're saying you lost the diamond? Kirk's voice combined skepticism. I would if I believed in oaths, Stephen replied. I really needed the money then, and I really thought I'd make money on the delivery. I sympathize. Kirk grinned. You were left without a diamond and without money. I know it was a lot for someone like you. Janie must have passed the task on to someone just like you. Kirk indignantly clattered the dishes with the kettle. Kirk, Brian Neil Ono, behave himself. Kirk obeyed his sister enough to even throw a Stephen. I'm sorry, but you're partly right. The man grinned mirthfully. I needed that money badly. I thought I could get my mother into a rehab center, he added. Stephen had told almost no one about his past in recent years. It was just generalities, because what was there to tell? It's embarrassing. And that's if we don't talk about his last act, about betraying his own mother and leaving her to her fate. Suddenly Stephen spoke. Words poured out of him in a free flow. But he didn't speak in order to get sympathy. He just needed to share it all. His childhood, his youth, how his mother had left him, and how it had ended. He also told that about 6 months after he left his mother, he began to doubt the rightness of his action and decided that no, you can't leave her like that, even though drinking was, in fact, her choice. Stephen decided to go back, but when he arrived, it turned out that his mother had been moved to the hospital because her health had gotten quite bad. Hospitalized right out of the barracks. One of the homeless people sympathized and called an ambulance. Stephen rushed there and was allowed to enter the room. Since Adriana had no insurance, the hospital naturally provided the bare minimum of services. Doctors said that they managed to save the body, but the mind. In general, drunkenness and life shocks. All this led to the fact that Adriana began to go crazy, and the doctors said that according to the rules should be discharged, and further is not their business. Unfortunately, where will the patient go? Stephen was lucky to get a job on a fishing boat. Prospects were excellent, but that's if he lived alone, forgetting his mother. Now things had changed dramatically. With great difficulty, he managed to find a boarding house for the elderly, where Adriana with her diagnosis was accepted. And it cost a lot. Plus, there was a down payment for several months in advance. Stephen asked the owner of a fishing boat for help, and he agreed to lend the necessary amount. In return, however, Stephen had to work almost without a salary for about a year. He agreed. He paid for his mother, and then, when he started traveling around the country, he continued to do so. It was hard, but he kept going. The only thing he didn't have the strength for was to visit her. He had never seen her once in all those years. He still couldn't forgive her for ruining his new life through hers. She had ruined it for him too. And he was also afraid of her just reproaches. Though the doctors at that boarding house had said that Adriana had little grasp of reality. But lately the thing was that recently he had been contacted by the boarding house and told that his mother's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The doctors said to prepare for the worst, and Stephen sort of looked at himself from the outside. What kind of man is he? Is it even after so many years, and now that his mother has become quite old and helpless, He cannot let go of offenses, even if just. He could not find the strength to come closer to her, to brighten her last time with his presence, as a good son should do. Conscience was cutting, gnawing. When else would it make itself known through the years? A dull ache in once broken bones. Except Stephen couldn't cross that threshold. He couldn't not only not forgive, but agree that his mother was important in his life, not existing on its margins as an unfortunate duty, which he had to fulfill only for moral reasons. And when Stephen's story was over, when he had poured out his soul in front of these two, in fact, strangers, who had only once appeared in his life as participants in the unfortunate episode, he suddenly felt better. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Kirk sat with his arms folded across his chest, looking past Stephen to the sea outside the window. Tessa shouldered his thin fingers and looked directly at Stephen, as if she intended to peer into the deepest corners of his soul. "What happened to you can't be compared to anything," Tessa said quietly. "Every person's experience is unique. But she hesitated, because she obviously hurried to unite her feelings with her brother, whose opinion about the story Stephen did not yet know. "I can understand," she continued. "How does it feel to lose everything? We lost the family business, the competitors. They came in and took everything away. We went out of business and pretty much lost everything. We had to sell the family home. We couldn't keep it anymore. It turned out my father had a business loan, and the insurance was written in such a way that the insurance company refused to pay anything. We sold almost everything," Kirk added. "There's a little left, but it's crumbs compared to what it used to be. All the proceeds went into building this house. First they made the foundation. Then Tessa went to school to make it just the way she wanted it. Tessa had always wanted to live by the sea. What so many generations of our family had treasured was taken from us. But perhaps," he grinned thoughtfully, "it's for the best in a way. At least now I have a chance to do what I wanted to do. Otherwise I'd have been sitting in the big boss's office all my life." I think Tissot kicked him under the desk with his foot, because Kirk jerked and walked in, quietly sending his sister an angry look. "Well, sometimes, of course, the saying goes that it wouldn't have been lucky if misfortune had helped," Stephen said. "Only the price for change is high, isn't it? And as for me, well, I don't think my life can basically go back to normal. It just doesn't seem to be by fate." Stephen's a little miffed by that comparison. Come to think of it, they had lost everything, but had enough money to still build such a house by the sea in a resort town on the background of the fact that he was actually on the street. It certainly hurt. Plus the thought slipped in that if he hadn't gone to the crypt then, you would have taken the stone. He would have gotten the money, returned quietly by a different route, and not been captured by the police. He wouldn't have gone to jail. He could have put his mother in rehab. And the curse. His whole life could have gone right. Maybe if things hadn't gone so wrong back then. But it wasn't really Kirk's fault. It was Stephen himself who screwed it up. "All right, I'll go now." Stephen rose from the table. "Thanks for the tea." He smiled at Taxi. The girl got up to the sink with the dishes. Kirk rose to follow, clearly intending to walk her to the front door. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Stephen said, already on the doorstep with repairs. "Anyway, do you mind if I keep doing things around here?" "Why not?" Kirk shrugged. "As long as you're doing your professional duties, you're welcome to come." The words were said politely and to the point, but as if with an undertone. Stephen inwardly tensed that Kirk noticed the glances he was throwing at his sister. So they were just glances. It's clear as day that Stacy can be absolutely nothing. The next day was quite ordinary. The house was bustling with work, though she didn't show up at all. She usually stopped by every other day to see how the construction and finishing projects were going. This day everything was falling apart, but Stephen held his ground and didn't even swear when one of the workers, a young boy who was still a green trainee, accidentally dropped it on his foot. Returning home in the evening, Stephen habitually pressed the button on the phone to listen to the answering machine message. Usually there was nothing there, but now he heard an unfamiliar voice. He never hung his jacket on the coat rack. Stephen listened to him, The guy who introduced himself as Jeffrey said that they needed to meet urgently and talk. The matter is urgent. It concerns the boarding house where Stephen's mother lies. I'll be expecting you at the Gull tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Believe me, it's urgent. Stephen could not even guess who it was or what it wanted. But it seems that the mysterious Jeffrey did not belong to the staff of the boarding house. Work on the house involving Stephen's team. The next day were scheduled from 9 o'clock, so it was literally possible to get an hour off. The Seagull establishment was opened back in the 30s of the last century and served as a true gem of a marina, from which almost all 4 seasons opened pleasure boats running along the coast. Stepping inside, Stephen noticed it at once. A young fellow sitting at the farthest table, near which stands a lemon tree in a tub. On his head cap pretends to read a newspaper. Good afternoon. Stephen sits down on the seat opposite Jeffrey. Yes, he asked, and after a nod continued. I recognized him right away. It's just that those who are wearing caps now are walking around, and you are like hiding from someone. So what is it? What did you want? The waitress came over, and they both ordered a cup of coffee, so as not to sit empty-handed. Jeffrey was visibly nervous, but at the same time he gave the impression of an educated and serious young man. It turned out that a year ago his family decided to put his grandfather in the boarding house. Unfortunately, the old man was diagnosed with dementia, and he also constantly dreamed that he was being hunted by some secret agents. At first it turned out that everything was normal, and when Harry visited, he smiled, saying that everything was great, and the boarding house seemed just a resort. But then something alerted Jeffrey to this. Something was that Harry suddenly changed his delusional fantasies. Now he was saying that he and the other boarding house residents were being abused, and only on visiting days they changed him into clean clothes and told him not to complain to his relatives. And it was very strange, because the psychiatrist who had previously seen Harry said that his disease of the mind is characterized by a fixation on what has absolutely nothing to do with the surrounding reality. Grandfather said there was proof of that. Jeffrey continued with a sigh. He said that if you went to the first floor, you could go down to the basement, where they had made a punishment cell for the naughty ones. I decided to check it out, and when I left, I pretended I'd forgotten something in Grandpa's room and walked on unnoticed. I found the stairs to the basement. The door was unlocked, and there was a light on downstairs. There was indeed a room and a door with a window. I looked in and saw 2 orderlies tying up an old lady. It wasn't the kind of room where, you know, they can lock up a violent patient for a while. It was just a hole with a cement floor walls. It was cold, damp. This poor woman was sitting on the floor in her nightgown. Her hands were shackled, seen shackled in museums. Could it be the same thing? I managed to make a short video. I managed to get up and pretend it never happened. I went to my lawyer, and he believed me. I was lucky. He said another man had approached him with the same complaints. His relative had given up a lot. His health got worse in that boarding house, and the lawyer said it was serious. The owner of the boarding house is a powerful, respected member of the community. The police would need a good reason, apart from the complaints of the old people and the videotape, which they would check if it was taken from a horror movie or a fake. And so I decided to contact other people whose relatives are in that boarding house and see if they noticed anything strange in the behavior or condition of their relatives. Maybe if we teamed up, we could make it work. Stephen listened to Jeffrey without interrupting, and he believed him from the first word, because his gut told him the guy wasn't lying. But there was something else that was dark, something that was bothering me. This woman you saw, Stephen asked in a hushed voice. What did she look like? Seemed very petite, Jeffrey said. Gray hair, cut short. It was dark in there, but I'd better show you. He hurriedly pulled out a smartphone and handed it to Stephen. That's my mother, Stephen said, barely seeing the video. But it took his breath away. I haven't seen her in a very long time. I've only been told she's doing well. That's my mother. I'm going to get her. He raised his voice so high and jumped up so sharply, almost knocking over a table, that other visitors to the Gull encroached on them. It's not that simple. Jeffrey shook his head. Did you read the contract to discharge the patient? His condition is mental and physical. A special committee must first determine. This is to protect the boarding house from possible claims. Suddenly, one of the old people will become ill due to the negligence of relatives when they have already taken the guest, and so there will be evidence that the deterioration is not the boarding house's fault. So it'll take about a week. Are you already taking the grandfather? Stephen asked. Yes, Jeffrey nodded. I've applied. I don't care. Stephen exhaled. I'm not going to wait for her to be bullied any longer. I'm going right now. Only it was much easier to say than to do. The bus to get to the village, near which the boarding house was located, left only late at night, and there was no money for a cab because Stephen had not been spending his budget very carefully lately. The advance wasn't due until the day after tomorrow. On top of that, the phone was ringing off the hook. The foreman demanded that Stephen report to the site immediately or he would be fired. I had to comply. And besides, Stephen decided he'd try to get some cab fare from Matt or Murdoch, for instance. But when he got to the house, neither was there. The first had taken time off work because a child had fallen down the slide and had been taken to hospital with a suspected fracture. And the second went to scandalize the supplier of coffee tiles for the fact that, despite 100 clarifications, sent the wrong shade. So we'll have to wait. Everything okay? Asked Kirk, who was in the house that day to sign a couple of papers to accept the delivery of the next final stage of work. Yes, nodded Stephen. Yesterday's state of mind, when he was pouring his soul out, was far behind him. But it wasn't completely silent either. You're not wearing a face, Kirk snorted. Is it something with your mother? Yes, Stephen blurted out. I have to leave immediately. And he outlined the current situation in a few sentences. You're talking. The lawyer's name is Archibald Stone. I know the guy. He and I go sailing sometimes. We've known each other since high school, Kirk said. He said he's working on a case right now involving some big shot. I sympathize with you, but how are you going to pull this off? Do you want to just barge in and take her? Why not? Stephen's fists were itching, as they say, and his thoughts were racing frantically. I'm afraid those words were not easy to say, but they had to be said. I'm afraid I won't make it, Mom, if anything happens to her. I'm sorry. I must be distracting myself from the really important things, Stephen said with a bitter chuckle, because Kirk was suddenly distracted by his cell phone, apparently texting someone. So I guess this is what we'll do, he muttered. We leave in half an hour. What? Stephen rounded up, eyes at a loss. Are you going with me? I think Dennis alone. Can you manage? He smiled at Sill's eyes. And I brought someone with me. So I think there's going to be a problem. Yeah, that's probably it, sighed Stephen. Not us, them. Kirk patted him on the shoulder. And it came out so unexpectedly reassuring and friendly, almost brotherly, that Stephen's heart warmed. Stephen had thought the foreman would grumble, perhaps threaten to quit. But when Kirk had said a word or two, he let him go easily. I told him that I was paying for the construction, so I had the right to take you away for a while if I really needed to, on personal business. And I said that if he didn't have time to do something because of that, I wouldn't make any claims, and I'd pay for an extra day for the crew to finish everything. Cleared Zelina's situation. The eye cut out onto the suburban highway. The car was driving at the maximum allowable speed, and taking into account that the highway was busy, Stephen was forced to admit. Great driver. Almost all the way past in silence, and when they arrived, at the gate of the boarding house territory, they were met by another car, from which came out some very formidable-looking shaven-headed type in a black leather jacket. Who is it? Stephen asked bluntly, because he didn't quite know what was going on. An acquaintance, carelessly clarified Kirk, clearly not wanting to go into detail. Let's say, although the firm is gone, but there are still some old connections. He was silent for a while, And while they were waiting for the guard to come out of the gate, he continued, "In general, if we tried hard, we could keep the firm 10% to success. Theoretically there was, but Tessa wasn't ready to shoulder the load. And it's not that I chickened out, but my father always said if you're not sure about something, you shouldn't do it. We saved what we could. And I think we're on the right track now." The guard who came out said glumly that today was not a day for visiting guests, which means they need one. We need to see the director of the whole place, about his skinny-headed type. "Look, you're not a security guard." I was about to object, but the skinheads did. Leaned over to him, whispered something in his ear, and the guard's face stretched. His face turned pale. "Why didn't you say so in the first place?" Almost. He shouted in a frightened voice and opened the gate, clearing the way. "What did he say to him?" Stephen inquired. "He hinted that if we weren't allowed in, Mr. Jonathan Green would be very unhappy. That say, many people believe that he has something to do with our Irish mafia and that his name is on the rumor. And that it's true." Stephen was not at all smiling at having anything to do with the mafia. "That's not exactly what people say," Kirk grinned. "But Jonathan Gray was once my father's golf club partner." He nodded at the leather-jacketed man. "His stepson Peter, who we shared a sandbox with." "Nice to meet you." "A pleasure," Peter asked menacingly without looking at Stephen. "But if you have such acquaintances, why didn't you defend your father's inheritance?" Stephen still could not see the logic in the actions of his brother and sister. "I've already explained," Kirk answered sighingly but patiently. Father himself would have done the same thing if one day he could no longer manage the business properly. We would have brought the firm down and ruined all the reputation our family had built up. This way we kept the family honor and a few % of the stock. The cars stopped in the parking lot of the boarding house, and now there was no time to talk. Stephen could barely keep from breaking into a run. The guard, glancing at the small company, subserviently escorted them to the director's office. And now Stephen realistically barely restrained himself from just punching her with his fist, or preferably two. On the cold round face of the director with the connivance, or maybe with the instructions of which defenseless old people were treated so disgustingly. Unlike the guard, the headmaster was not so accommodating, and even the mention of the powerful Mr. Gray did not seem to affect him at first. However, he was still nervous, twirling the pen in his fingers. His eyes were racing. "I swear, no one has ever complained about our establishment before." Finally, in desperation, he declared, "We treat all old people as our own kin. And besides, pardon me, but the headmaster gave Kirk a hard look. Do we have any of your relatives, sir?" "No, fortunately not," Kirk grinned wickedly. "I wouldn't trust you with an old rat, sir. And as for complaints, personally, since I have had no dealings with you, I will make no complaint." But when his palms hit the countertops, he jerked forward, nearly smashing his forehead into Nolito. The nervous beauty of the headmaster's face. "But it would be sad if I witnessed my friend being denied his legal right to take his own mother. Wouldn't it? There's more to it than just the rules in your contract, right? And legally, you have no right to keep her. Isn't that right? I see you're well aware of that." The director's tone was more accommodating and almost visionary. "Of course, I have now arranged for the mother of this esteemed Mr. Stephen to be helped to pack." "Don't bother," snorted Kirk. "You will escort him to her now." The headmaster reached again to loosen the knot of his tie with half a finger and nodded. "One more thing," Stephen added boldly, and following Kirkorov's example, moved toward the director. "Do you have another old man?" Stephen's heart was allowed in this okay, which stopped. He walked down the corridor and pondered what to say to her. First of all, to apologize, to promise that he would not leave her again. But now they were in front of the ward. A nurse in a strict gray dress, who looked terribly displeased and but had to obey, opened the lock of the door, and it fell away. Adriana sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window. Or rather, at the window, because it was closed with the blinds down. How had she aged? Stephen thought. "Is it really her, Mother?" Quietly he called out. Adriana slowly turned her head. At first he thought it was too late, but the expression on her face had changed. And the main thing was not even the smile on her pale lips, but the way her eyes lit up in a flash. Stephen on the verge of hearing. She dropped the word son. I'm awake. No, Mom. Stephen, unashamed of the tears in his eyes, stepped toward her. A moment later, he knelt down in front of the bed. He plunged into the warm embrace of his mother's arms, just as he had done long ago, when he was a child. Mom, I'm back. I brought you back. Kirk and Peter froze on the doorstep, and then tactfully stepped out behind him and covered the door, so as not to interfere with the intimacy of two people finally dooming each other. However, it was still almost 2 o'clock before they could all leave the boarding house. The reason for the delay was Harry, who at first got scared, thinking that he had done something wrong and would be taken to the SAU for it. Then he said that secret agents from London were waiting to capture him and bring him to the tower to be tried by the Virgin Queen. The old man was so stubborn that Stephen finally decided on a highly atypical act. He said he had personally witnessed Harry's grandson deal coolly with a couple of such agents, and then took a written promise from them that they would leave Harry alone. And the scroll was secured with the Queen's ring. On a wave of creative imagination, finished Stephen. True raised bones and eyebrows that resembled Harry's snow-white caterpillars. And what was depicted on the seal? May I ask, Lilia? Assumed Stephen, belatedly remembering that it was a symbol of sorts from the French monarchy. Aha! Harry grinned and clapped his hands together. I knew Louis had something to do with this. Well, in that case, I'm calm. So what are we standing here for? Come on, let's go. And then, when they were already down on the porch, Harry turned toward the boarding house, picked up a pebble from the ground, and swung it at his neck. Sent it flying all the way to the window of the headmaster's office. Cool. Sincerely admired Stephen. Let's go quickly, he hurried everyone. But how did you do it? Geoffrey, whom Stephen had telephoned to say that Harry would be waiting for him at the Gull, was shocked when he heard what had happened. I'm not. Stephen shrugged his shoulders. Was that it? Him. He nodded at Kirk, who was clearly uncomfortable with being grabbed. And now he rolled his eyes and muttered that please stop talking about it, since the case was already done. I was at the lawyer's office, Geoffrey told me excitedly. He said the paperwork was finally ready. The last time I talked to him was a week ago, and he really seems to know how to work. So we're going home now. What about the family? Stephen asked. Won't they want to send Harry to the orphanage again? Or will you look for a good place this time? I actually thought it would be best for him, sighed Geoffrey. I think I'll take a vacation from work for a while. I'm a photographer for a magazine, and basically they can do without me for a bit. There's someone to replace me. I think I can look after Grandpa for a while, and then I'll think about it. But I certainly don't trust him to anyone else. The hero of the discussion was sitting there, and the varnish was chocolate for the money. The whole company occupied a large table, so there was enough room for everyone. Adriana just sat and looked through the window at the sea, over which seagulls were flying. It had been a long day. Stephen himself had to make up his mind. After all, he lived in a tiny apartment and could not imagine how he would be able to combine work and taking care of his mother, who still had a little bit, but had problems with consciousness. But once again, Kirk surprised him by saying that it was possible to hire a good nurse for Stephen's mother, or even better too, to work in shifts. And for comfortable living, of course, it would be better to move into a 2-room apartment. And then, of course, Adriana should be examined as soon as possible and as fully as possible to determine the necessary treatment for her. Unfortunately, Kirk noted, there was a strong possibility that she would still need constant medication and medical supervision. Thanks for the advice, Stephen sighed. But I don't think I can afford all that. I'll keep it simple, brief, and even a little strict, Kirk said. No objections, he added. An emotion of shock and amazement came over Stephen's face. I can help with that, Geoffrey said. You got my grandfather out of there. I owe you a debt of gratitude." Stephen was confused. "What do you mean, essentially strangers?" "Yeah, they were both very wealthy, but it's still an offer of help. I don't know what to say." He expressed his feelings honestly. "I just did." "Thank you. I will." "There's no need to say anything," Kirk said. "Better just do it, and do it soon," he added, nodding at Harry, who was flirtatiously informing a passing young waitress that he could show her around the world because he had secret agents as friends. The next few days, or rather weeks, passed in incredible bustle. They seemed to stretch on like an eternity, and yet they flew by so quickly. Stephen's mother and he were settled in an apartment downtown, with attentive professional caregivers to help manage everything. Kirk helped Stephen negotiate an emergency vacation at work. Jeffrey kept him in the loop. The director of the boarding house and his assistants had finally been charged appropriately, and all the elderly wards had finally been taken care of. The renovation of the house, by the way, was finally completed, and one day Tessa said that she wanted to meet Stephen, that they needed to talk. At first it was about how nice the house was, and how glad Tessa was that Stephen was doing so well with his mother. And then somehow Stephen asked Tessa out on a date. She froze, frozen, with only her long pearl earrings swaying. "And here I thought you'd never go for it." Suddenly she laughed. "And I'll have to do it all myself." "You mean ask you out on dates? That wouldn't be so romantic." He was amazed that she'd been looking at him for a long time, and now he could breathe a sigh of relief that the date had gone well. And then, yes, Stephen still mentally returned to his doubts that he was not a match for Odessa, and even thought with trepidation about how soon the relationship would undoubtedly have to be severed. "We should talk," Kirk said. Stephen was at his and Tessa's house at the time. She had recommended him as a good repairman to several of her friends and had called him over to discuss details of future work and to give him a couple of tips on future clients. These friends, as Stephen realized, were very rich people, and he thus had the opportunity to build up a large client base so that he could leave the firm and work as a private master. "Or maybe you could start your own company one day," Tessa told him. And it was clear she wasn't kidding. "Good," agreed Stephen with a pick. The men stood on the veranda, the sun slanting over the horizon. Seagulls flew over the water. "I didn't tell you this," Kirk said with a sigh, "but my sister hopes you'll propose to her soon." "Yeah," Stephen gasped with excitement. He had thought about it, but it seemed like an unrealistic dream. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "Good," Kirk nodded. "Because I'm not going to let anyone play with my namesake. I don't know what she sees in you, but I respect her choice." Kirk's hand came down on Stephen's shoulder. The fingers squeezed made her happy. "I believe in you. I'm giving you a chance. But remember, if you see my sister, I'll send you to the other world with my own hands." Stephen smiled. He had no doubt that he loved his namesake and that he would do anything to make her happy.